What if royalty wasn't just born into power, but bred for it? Across empires and centuries, kings and queens didn't just marry for love, they married their own blood. Brothers and sisters, uncles and nieces, cousins on repeat. Behind the crowns and portraits lie tangled family trees, whispered affairs, and dynasties collapsing under the weight of their own genes. This isn't just history, it's a royal echo chamber of obsession, control, and uncanny repetition. Welcome to 30 royals who had affairs with their own relatives, because keeping it in the family was the whole point. Before we dive in, make sure you hit subscribe. It keeps the royal bloodline of this channel alive. And while you're at it, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Madrid? 3 a.m. in Manila? We're dying to know who else is wide awake, unraveling royal scandals with us. 1. Caligula, Roman Emperor. There's a reason the word Caligula no longer sounds like a name, but a diagnosis. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, he was the great-grandson of Augustus, Rome's first emperor, and the third to wear the purple toga. But history didn't remember him for his bloodline, it remembered him for what he allegedly did with it. By the time he took the throne in 37 AD, Caligula was already a kind of tragic celebrity. His childhood was a parade of trauma. His father was likely poisoned, his mother and 2 brothers executed, and he was raised in the shadows of power, beloved by the people but mistrusted by emperors. They called him Caligula, meaning little boots, after the tiny soldier's uniform he wore while toddling around his father's army camps. A cute nickname if you forget that the kid eventually grew up to allegedly commit incest with all 3 of his sisters. Drusilla, Agrippina, Livilla, all high-born women, all imperial daughters, and according to nearly every surviving hostile ancient source, all rumoured to have been sexual companions of their brother the emperor. The most infamous of these was Drusilla, Caligula's favourite. She was said to be more than a sister, more than a mistress, more than a wife. He allegedly referred to her as my Venus, and when she died of a fever in 38 AD, he shut down the empire, declared public mourning, had her deified. In a culture where even wives were rarely deified, that was more than a brotherly gesture. Roman historians, never ones to miss an opportunity for moralizing horror stories, claimed the relationship was well known in the palace, even whispered in the streets. But it's hard to know where fact ends and vendetta begins. Most of what we know about Caligula comes from writers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, men with an axe to grind, scribbling years after the emperor's death, in an empire where slandering dead rulers was practically a patriotic sport. Still, the incest rumors stuck, and they weren't just whispered after his death, they were shouted during his life. Political cartoons, yes, ancient Rome had them, depicted the emperor in compromising positions with family members. Senators spoke behind fans. Even courtiers, who depended on imperial favor, tiptoed around the subject with the kind of cautious euphemisms you use when the lion's still in the room. Why his sisters? Power, perhaps. Control. Or maybe, in the most ironic twist of all, it was political theatre. The Julio-Claudian dynasty believed themselves semi-divine, descendants of gods. To Caligula, who openly claimed divinity, bringing his sisters into the imperial bedchamber may have been a way to restore a Hellenistic model of rulership where gods marry their siblings and mortals keep their mouths shut. That same year Drusilla died, Caligula ordered coins minted with her face. Not as a sister, not as a martyr, as a goddess. The Roman people, already unsettled by the emperor's increasingly bizarre behavior, parading as a living deity, threatening to appoint a horse to the Senate, demanding worship, now had to grapple with a man who didn't just rule like a god, but loved like one too. The question isn't whether Caligula did these things. The question is why so many people believed he did. The Roman Empire was obsessed with lineage, legacy, and blood, but it was also terrified of what happened when those things got too close. Caligula, whether through madness or method, forced Rome to look into the mirror of its own mythology. You want gods for rulers? Fine, but gods don't play by mortal rules. Drusilla's death didn't end the rumors. His other sisters, Agrippina and Livilla, were also implicated in the shadow play of imperial scandal. Some accounts suggest they were even prostituted by Caligula to curry political favor. Others claimed he merely paraded them at banquets in transparent gowns like prizes. The lines between theatre and truth, between court ritual and personal violation, remain blurred to this day. And then came the knives. In 41 AD, just 4 years into his reign, Caligula was stabbed to death by his own bodyguard in a palace corridor. His wife and daughter were murdered hours later. The Senate tried to erase him from history. His statues were smashed, his name was struck from records, but his memory remained, raw, unresolved, grotesque. A symbol of power without boundaries, desire without breaks. Centuries later, modern historians still debate whether the incest happened, but in a way, the facts almost don't matter. The myth did what myths always do. It explained the unexplainable. An emperor who ruled like a child playing God and treated his sisters like dolls in his divine playhouse. And if Caligula's story feels like a cautionary tale wrapped in a fever dream, just wait, because the next emperor didn't just inherit Rome's throne, he may have inherited Caligula's appetite. Only this time, the alleged partner wasn't a sister, it was his mother. 2. Nero, Roman emperor. By the time Nero became emperor in AD 54, Rome was already exhausted, tired of gods on thrones, tired of golden boys with bloodlust, tired of pretending emperors were fatherly shepherds rather than walking catastrophes in purple cloaks. So when the teenage Nero ascended, young, charming, art-obsessed, not yet soaked in scandal, there was a brief breath of hope, a flicker of normalcy. That flicker didn't last long. He was 17, awkward, enthralled with poetry, music, Greek theatre. He preferred performing to governing, playing the lyre to commanding legions. He spoke with tenderness at first about freedom, reform, generosity, but in the shadows behind him stood a woman who did not believe in soft power. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, one of the most formidable political tacticians in Roman history. A niece of Emperor Claudius, a sister of Caligula, a widow, a survivor, and, if ancient rumors are to be believed, possibly something else to her son. Now let's pause here. Allegations of incest between Nero and Agrippina have haunted Roman history like a ghost in the rafters. Tacitus, that ever-sarcastic chronicler of imperial dysfunction, reports that the rumors were common knowledge. Other sources say Agrippina used her beauty, her closeness, even her wardrobe to seduce influence from her son. Whether metaphor or reality, the whispers were clear. Power between mother and son was not just political, it was uncomfortably intimate. What we know is this: Agrippina had clawed her way back into the palace by marrying her uncle, Emperor Claudius. She then convinced him to adopt her son, Nero, placing the boy ahead of Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. When Claudius mysteriously died, suddenly, conveniently, and possibly with poisoned mushrooms involved, Nero was ready to rule, and Agrippina was ready to rule through him. At first, she appeared on coins beside her son. A Roman first, she attended Senate meetings, welcomed foreign dignitaries, and had her own guards. Nero, barely out of adolescence, was surrounded by advisors handpicked by his mother. For a while, he seemed willing to play the part, dutiful, deferential, almost boyishly obedient. And the Roman elite looked on with a mix of admiration and fear. Because the empire, it seemed, had two rulers, and one wore no laurel wreath, but Nero began to chafe, to push back. He took mistresses, spoke out, sang on stage. He flirted with the idea of being his own man. And that's when the allegations started to twist into darker shapes. The more Nero tried to assert his independence, the more Agrippina allegedly tried to bind him. Ancient authors claim she interrupted his private meetings, sat in on his council, and, in the most theatrical version, once stormed into his bedroom and accused him of neglecting her, before embracing him a little too long. This isn't a soap opera, it's a pattern. A psychological knot wrapped in a political one. In a regime where lineage was legitimacy, where blood granted power, family ties could strangle as much as they connected. Whether there was any physical relationship is, of course, debated. Modern historians lean towards skepticism. They point to the ancient habit of sexualizing powerful women to discredit them, especially mothers. Agrippina was feared, so she was vilified. And what better way to vilify a woman than to accuse her of the ultimate taboo, corrupting her own son? Still, something about the rumor stuck. Maybe because Nero's later actions made it plausible. The turning point came when Nero ordered Agrippina's death, not once, multiple times. First, he tried to have her drowned in a collapsible boat, a marvel of Roman engineering and Freudian symbolism. She swam to shore. Then he sent assassins. She reportedly bared her chest and told them to strike the womb that bore him. They obliged. Even in death, Agrippina haunted Nero. He began seeing visions. He grew erratic. His artistic obsessions turned obsessive. He declared himself a living god, burned Rome, or at least stood watching as it burned, then blamed it on Christians. He traveled Greece, demanded applause, sang love poems, performed tragedies while Rome rotted behind him. It's tempting to draw a straight line from the alleged incest to Nero's descent into delusion, a neat moral arc. But real history resists that kind of symmetry. What we're left with is something messier. A teenage emperor manipulated by a mother who knew how empires worked, a power struggle disguised as a family dynamic, and a scandal whispered in marble halls that grew louder with every failure of the regime. And maybe that's the most Roman part of all. They didn't just gossip, they mythologized. They turned family dysfunction into state prophecy. They made the emperor's private sins into public warnings. And in Nero, they found the perfect storm. An insecure boy with a god complex dancing in his mother's shadow while the world burned around him. But if you think imperial mothers were the only ones accused of seducing their sons, or that Rome held a monopoly on dynastic dysfunction, you haven't met the next royal family. Their palace wasn't in Rome, but in Judea, and their sibling bond made the Senate's rumors look tame. 2 emperors down, 28 to go, and we're only just peeling back the velvet curtain. If you're into dynastic drama, divine delusions, and royal bloodlines that loop like bad dreams, hit subscribe to stay tangled with us. And hey, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Is it late enough to question everything, or early enough to pretend this is educational? Tell us below. 3. Herod Agrippa II, ruler of Judea, and Berenice. The house of Herod was not a royal family so much as a dynastic pressure cooker, a knot of alliances, jealousies, betrayals, and calculated marriages held together by fragile Roman favor and a deeply personal interpretation of the word family. It was, in short, a family where boundaries were either theoretical or negotiable. And that brings us to Herod Agrippa II and his sister Berenice. 2 siblings whose closeness would be whispered about from palace balconies to Roman amphitheaters. Herod Agrippa II was the last of his line to rule under the Herodian name. Born around 27 CE, he was the great-grandson of Herod the Great, the king best remembered for massacring newborns in the Gospel of Matthew, and lesser known for his architectural genius and paranoid habit of executing his own sons. With that kind of legacy, Agrippa II's career was already teetering before it began. By the time he inherited his territory, Judea was a province in permanent spiritual crisis. The Jewish population resented Roman rule. The temple elite were corrupt, zealots were multiplying, the empire was watching. Into this mess stepped Agrippa II, not quite a king, not quite a client, and very much a man in the middle. He ruled parts of northern Palestine, Galilee, and the Golan region, a patchwork kingdom more symbolic than sovereign. But what he lacked in raw power, he made up for in proximity to actual power. Roman governors, high priests, and his younger sister, Berenice. Berenice was, by all accounts, striking, charismatic, politically savvy, and extremely visible. Widowed twice by her early 20s, she returned to her brother's court after the death of her second husband, and that's where the whispers began. Roman historians, never known for discretion, took note. Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, all either hinted at or directly accused the pair of being more than siblings. According to these sources, Berenice wasn't just sharing power with her brother, she was sharing a bed. Modern scholars are, as usual, divided. Some argue the accusations were rooted in misogyny. Berenice was a politically active woman who didn't fit the Roman mold of demure femininity. Others point to the fact that these incest rumors emerged precisely when Berenice's public profile was rising. She appeared beside Agrippa in court, issued edicts, gave speeches, and sat alongside him in judgment, acts that were normal for queens in the Hellenistic East, but deeply unnerving to Roman commentators. Still, the gossip was relentless. It dogged her so much that, according to ancient accounts, Berenice briefly married a king, Polemon II of Pontus, seemingly to silence the talk. But the marriage didn't last. She returned to Agrippa's side not long after. The whispers resumed. Of course, if this were just idle palace gossip, it might have faded. But then Berenice did something that guaranteed her infamy. She became the lover of Titus. Yes, that Titus, the Roman general who sacked Jerusalem in 70 CE and later became emperor. While Jerusalem burned and the Second Temple fell, Berenice, a Jewish princess and sister to Agrippa, was living with the man who ordered the destruction. That image alone made her radioactive. To Roman audiences, she was dangerous. A foreign queen, politically active, seductive, and, if the rumors were true, tainted by an incestuous past. When she followed Titus back to Rome, some expected a royal wedding. The emperor-in-waiting had other plans. Under pressure from the Senate and public opinion, Titus dismissed her without ceremony. Berenice disappeared from history shortly after. And what of Agrippa II? He faded too. His kingdom shrank, his relevance evaporated after the Jewish revolt. He died childless, probably in his 70s, sometime before 100 CE. The Herodian dynasty, that tangled, blood-bound mess of Roman puppetry and biblical tragedy, ended with him. So, what do we make of the Berenice rumors? Was it just another case of Roman slander, a politically powerful woman made monstrous by misogyny? Or was it a reflection of real intimacy that blurred lines in a court where power, blood, and survival were often indistinguishable? Perhaps the most interesting part of this story isn't whether they shared a bed, but why the idea was so compelling. For Roman authors, it was the perfect scandal, a half-Jewish princess implicated in the destruction of her own people, romantically tied to both her brother and a Roman conqueror. It practically wrote itself, but if Agrippa and Berenice challenged the lines of sibling propriety, the next member of their family would take things a step further, abandoning pretense entirely and replacing it with a scandal so open that even Rome couldn't pretend not to notice. He married his niece, while still married to someone else, and that niece, she was already married to his brother. 4. Herod Antipas, Tetrarch of Galilee. If the Herodian dynasty was a snake devouring its own tail, Herod Antipas was the forked tongue. Son of Herod the Great and ruler of Galilee and Perea, he inherited not just a slice of territory, but a family drama so tangled it could only have been scripted by history's darkest imagination, or perhaps a disgruntled Roman historian with a flair for political soap opera. And at the center of his controversy was a woman named Herodias, who happened to be both his niece and his brother's wife. Not ex-wife, not estranged. Wife. Now, to be clear, royal incest wasn't exactly shocking in the ancient world. For Hellenistic monarchs and Near Eastern dynasties, endogamy, marrying within the bloodline, was a strategic maneuver, a way to keep power concentrated, properties intact, and dynastic claims unchallenged. What made Antipas's story scandalous was the timing, the audacity, and the chain reaction it would trigger across history, politics, and religion. Herod Antipas had been married already. His first wife was the daughter of Aretas IV, king of Nabatea, a neighboring Arab kingdom. This marriage, like most royal unions, was strategic, designed to secure a border alliance. It served its purpose until Herod Antipas visited Rome. There, in the capital of empire and decadence, he crossed paths with Herodias, his niece. She was the daughter of his half-brother Aristobulus, and at the time already married to another half-brother, Herod II, also known as Herod Boethus. According to Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian whose pen seemed dipped in barely contained disdain, Antipas and Herodias began a relationship that escalated quickly, emotionally, politically, and diplomatically. The outcome? A dramatic royal divorce. Antipas cast off his Nabatean wife, ignoring the fact that she was both politically vital and not especially inclined to be discarded. Herodias, in turn, abandoned her husband and daughter to join Antipas. The two were soon married. That's when the quiet scandal exploded into public outrage. Let's pause here and look at the tangled web. Herodias was Antipas's niece by blood. She was also the wife of his brother, which made her his sister-in-law. By marrying her, Antipas effectively folded a loop in the family tree and called it domestic policy. To many, this was more than a breach of etiquette. It was a violation of Jewish law, public decency, and basic family boundaries. Among the loudest critics was John the Baptist, a wilderness preacher who did not mince words. He denounced the union publicly and repeatedly, condemning Antipas's marriage as unlawful. It wasn't just religious outrage, it was political suicide. Herodias, predictably, was not amused. She viewed John's condemnations as more than mere annoyance. They were a threat to her legitimacy, to her husband's rule, and to the very architecture of her personal power. Antipas, caught between his new wife's fury and the religious sentiment John had stirred up, made a decision that would reverberate across centuries. He had John arrested. Now, if this all feels a little too familiar, it's because it is. The story of Herod Antipas, Herodias, and John the Baptist would be immortalized in the Gospels, transformed into a narrative of prophecy, lust, vengeance, and execution. In that version, Herodias' daughter famously dances before Herod, a performance that leads to a gruesome birthday request. But strip away the spiritual symbolism, and you're left with a very human political melodrama. A ruler seduced by power, a niece who weaponized lineage, and a prophet who couldn't stop telling the truth. What makes this episode even more remarkable is how openly it was discussed, even documented by contemporaries. Josephus, writing not as a religious zealot, but as a Jewish historian employed by Rome, confirms much of the outline: the affair, the divorce, the marriage, and the imprisonment of John. It was, in other words, not some whispered rumor passed down by gossips in alleyways. It was recorded, analyzed, and debated, a matter of public scandal with political consequences. Those consequences arrived swiftly. Aretas IV, the king whose daughter had been rejected, was understandably livid. He launched a military campaign against Antipas and won decisively. The defeat exposed the weakness of Antipas's position, both politically and militarily. He appealed to Rome for support, but even imperial favor couldn't shield him from the damage done by his family affair. Years later, his fortunes fell completely when he was exiled by Emperor Caligula. The Herodians, it turned out, were better at imploding than ruling. And yet, what lingers about this episode isn't just the politics or the public fallout, it's the irony. A man born into a dynasty obsessed with appearances, with keeping bloodlines neat and alliances tidy, destroyed his reign by stepping too close to his own lineage. He mistook proximity for power and desire for destiny. But if Antipas's scandal played out in courts and scriptures, the next royal affair existed in the shadowlands between tradition and taboo, a place where brother and sister weren't just kin, but sacred companions under a cultural system Western eyes have rarely tried to understand. In this next story, the boundaries of royal love weren't broken. They were never there to begin with. 5 Kamehameha III, Hawaii. When the missionaries arrived in Hawaii, they brought a long list of sins with them. Some were familiar: theft, violence, pride. Others were new: nudity, dance, chants, the moonlit touch of a lover who shared your bloodline. But to the alii, the ruling class of Hawaii, sin was not a universal currency. It was, like mana, contextual, rooted in genealogy, ritual, and a different kind of divine accounting. Which is why, when Kamehameha III entered into a relationship with his full sister Nahianaina, it wasn't greeted with scandal, not at first, not among his people, not in the way Westerners might expect, because to them it wasn't an affair, it was a statement. He was born in 1813, the son of Kamehameha the Great and Queen Keopuolani, and heir to a spiritual system in which rank, literal sacred rank, was passed not just through bloodlines, but through their intentional interweaving. The closer the blood, the purer the mana, and in alii logic, a full sibling union wasn't a taboo. It was a kind of sacred fusion, the ultimate expression of divine right. It didn't just legitimize power, it embodied it. Nahianaina was a high chiefess of extraordinary rank, considered by some to be the highest-born woman of her time. Together, she and Kamehameha III represented a lineage so concentrated that in traditional terms they were nearly godlike. Their union was more than personal, it was political theology. But history doesn't operate in a vacuum, and this was not the Hawaii of old gods and silent heiau. This was post-contact Hawaii, a kingdom in transition, caught in the undertow of colonial morality and Christian reform. By the 1820s and 1830s, missionaries from New England had established a foothold in the islands, bringing with them Bibles, printing presses, Protestant hymns, and Victorian eyebrows raised high in judgment. To the missionaries, the alii sibling marriage wasn't sacred, it was scandalous, sinful, unnatural. They saw themselves as liberators, stamping out paganism, breaking taboos, civilizing a people through moral re-education. They didn't understand that they were desecrating a logic far older than theirs. For Kamehameha III, the pressure was crushing. He was a king in waiting, a Western-educated ruler who could read and write, who signed laws and charters, and who was told daily that his culture, his gods, his ancestors were backward. And in the middle of this was Nahianaina, not just his sister, but the person who made his rule feel legitimate in the eyes of his own people. The relationship was never formally recognized as marriage, and that's part of the tragedy. The two were deeply close, emotionally, ritually, historically. But as the missionaries gained influence and Western norms bled into policy, their union became something they had to apologize for. Publicly, it was walked back. Spiritually, it remained charged. In 1835, Nahianaina was married off to a different chief, Leleiohoku, in a union more acceptable to Western eyes. Kamehameha III, now king, was advised by Christian missionaries and legal ministers. The tides of modernization, or at least westernization, were rising fast. But the personal cost of this moral pivot was devastating. Nahianaina died just 2 years later in 1836, shortly after giving birth to a child whose paternity was quietly debated. Some whispered it was Kamehameha's. Others claimed it was Leleohoku's. The child died shortly after birth, and with it something else died too, a chapter of Ali'i tradition that had once stood proudly against time and tide. Kamehameha III never recovered from her death. He would go on to become one of Hawaii's most influential monarchs, establishing a constitutional monarchy, instituting land reforms, and shaping the kingdom into a modern state. But beneath the legal innovations and political maneuvers was a man who had been asked to deny the very system that made him king. He ruled a country that no longer fully recognized the sacredness of his past. The story of Kamehameha III and Nahianaina is often sanitized or softened, reframed as a cultural curiosity or dismissed as a fading practice. But in reality, it reveals the sharp collision between two worldviews, one that measured worth through blood and tradition, and another that enforced morality through foreign definitions of shame. And so, the king who once stood at the apex of divine genealogy, who once looked into his sister's eyes and saw the history of 1,000 chiefs, was left alone, praised by Westerners as a modernizer, mourned quietly by his people as something else entirely. But if sibling unions among the Ali'i seem distant, poetic, and bound in sacred codes, the next ruler's story is something far more blunt. A Chinese emperor known not for ritual fusion or ancestral dignity, but for scandal, excess, and the kind of rumors that even time has trouble swallowing. 6. Liu Ziye, Emperor Qianfei, Liu Song, China. In the history of China's imperial dynasties, certain names inspire awe: Qin Shi Huang, Kang Shi, Wu Zetian, and then there are those whose names provoke a different reaction. Not reverence, but discomfort, curiosity, disbelief. Among these, Liu Ziye, better known as Emperor Qianfei of the Liu Song dynasty, occupies a particularly strange corner. His reign was brief, his death abrupt, and his legacy a kaleidoscope of accusation, rumor, and barely believable excess. But through it all, one whisper echoes louder than the rest: that the emperor took his own aunt and sister as companions in the imperial palace. Not wives, not concubines in the formal sense, but partners in a manner that left later historians baffled, scandalized, and quite frankly, unsure whether they were recording a political chronicle or a cautionary fable. Liu Ziye was born in 449 CE into a dynasty already cracking at the seams. The Liu Song had risen in the Southern Dynasty's period, following the collapse of the Eastern Jin, and while it technically ruled over a united southern China, real power was constantly shifting, not between kings and ministers, but between murder and paranoia. Court life was less a bureaucracy and more a bloodstream infected with coups. By the time Liu Ziye took the throne at age 16, he had already seen enough treachery to suspect everyone and trust no one. His father, Emperor Xiaowu, had climbed to power through intrigue and maintained it through ruthless consolidation. His uncles were either executed or exiled. Poison was not just a tactic, it was a vocabulary. And then came Qianfei, the Mad Emperor, as later chroniclers would call him. His reign lasted a single year, from 464 to 465 CE, but that year burned brightly with scandal. Official histories describe him as erratic, violent, and paranoid, to the point of self-destruction. He arrested high ministers without cause, killed nobles on whim, and was said to conduct random searches of his own guards, convinced that rebellion was everywhere. But the most persistent and disturbing rumors surround his alleged incestuous relationships, first with one of his paternal aunts, and then with his own sister. In Chinese imperial hierarchy, this would have been more than taboo. It would have been an act of cosmic disorder, a disruption of the Confucian hierarchy that structured not just family life, but the moral legitimacy of the emperor himself. Unfortunately, the line between fact and hostile court gossip is impossible to draw cleanly. Much of what we know about Liu Ziye comes from the Book of Song Shu, compiled by historians who had every reason to blacken the reputation of a deposed emperor. In their accounts, Qianfei invited his aunt into the palace under the pretense of caring for her after widowhood, and then elevated her to the status of consort. The same texts suggest he later turned his attention to his sister, treating her as a personal companion in ways that alarmed even his own staff. Were these relationships genuine, political, fabricated? The truth, like much of ancient court history, is filtered through the agendas of those who survived the emperor and needed his downfall to make sense. Incest allegations, especially involving women of the imperial clan, were among the most potent weapons in the court historian's arsenal. They discredited not just the ruler, but the entire moral foundation of his reign. And yet, something about these stories has the ring of twisted plausibility. Liu Ziye ruled alone, young and under siege. He may have surrounded himself with those he believed he could trust, relatives, especially royal women, who had no competing dynastic ambitions of their own. In a court where betrayal was expected and intimacy dangerous, the line between loyalty and dependence could blur in ways that feel unthinkable now, but were hauntingly logical in his world. His death came as swiftly as his rise. After only 1 year on the throne, he was assassinated by his own attendants, allegedly while asleep, though some accounts suggest it happened after one final public humiliation too far. His successor, his uncle, took power immediately, and the court wasted no time in scrubbing Qianfei's name from history. He was posthumously demoted, his reign labelled a moral aberration, his alleged crimes, incest included, repeated and preserved not as fact, but as warning. But what is a mad emperor really? A man who behaves without restraint, or a man who holds a mirror to the very system that created him? In Liu Ziye's court, bloodlines were both shields and shackles. They offered power, safety, maybe even affection, but at a cost. And whether his relationships with his aunt and sister were real or constructed, the legend left behind tells us what the court feared most. Not an emperor who broke the rules, but one who no longer recognized they existed. Still, if Qianfei's story feels extreme, imperial madness, incest, assassination, he wasn't alone in the family. His predecessor, too, had his own tangled record of blurred boundaries and questionable consorts. So if you thought the dysfunction stopped at the son, wait until you meet the father. 7. Emperor Xiaowu of Liu Song, China. If Emperor Qianfei was remembered as a one-year tyrant of incest and paranoia, then his father, Emperor Xiaowu, was the slow burn that set the fuse. His legacy wasn't a sudden explosion of scandal, but a drawn-out corrosion of the court's moral architecture. Less shocking, perhaps, but in some ways more unsettling, because while Qianfei's alleged relationships with his sister and aunt exploded like firecrackers in the annals of history, Xiaowu's own reputation is shaded in something darker. Quiet, deliberate erosion. His rule, from 453 to 464 CE, was a study in how imperial power could twist familial ties into something indistinguishable from policy or possession. Born Liu Jun, Emperor Xiaowu came to the throne under grim circumstances. His older brother, Emperor Wen, had been assassinated, allegedly on Xiaowu's orders. The family tree was already bleeding. Xiaowu's rise marked a turn in the Liu Song dynasty, away from the careful legalism of his predecessors and towards something far more personal. Where earlier emperors tried to couch their authority in Confucian language and ritual propriety, Xiaowu made no such pretense. His court revolved around him, and those he chose to keep close. Very close. Like many emperors before him, Xiaowu filled his harem with dozens of women from aristocratic families. That was expected, but unlike his predecessors, he seemed to have a particular preference for consorts drawn from within his own extended family, the daughters of his uncles, cousins, and in some cases, more immediate relatives. The pattern didn't go unnoticed. Chroniclers noted that the emperor disregarded kinship when selecting his companions. It wasn't just that he married within the clan for political alliance. He chose women whose family names matched his own, whose lineage ran parallel or even identical to his. Some of these relationships were formalized through marriage, others were not. The distinction mattered legally, but in practice, the line between consort and relative was often deliberately blurred. A few names stand out: women who were cousins on paper, but effectively treated as property within a dynastic compound where blood purity and erotic control were not seen as incompatible. In one case, Xiao Wu allegedly took the daughter of his deceased brother into the palace as a concubine, raising her first as a ward, then as a woman. Whether that story is true or another smear from later moralist historians is almost beside the point. The rumor was circulated, repeated, and, most importantly, believed. To understand how this could happen without widespread revolt, you have to understand the structure of Chinese imperial logic at the time. Unlike the Roman obsession with outward displays of scandal, Chinese courts masked impropriety beneath layers of ritual, formality, and silence. Actions that would have caused a political earthquake in another empire could be quietly folded into the fabric of dynastic power so long as they served the emperor's supremacy and didn't trigger open rebellion. And that's where Xiaowu excelled, in ambiguity. His relationships weren't open affairs. They were cloaked in legitimacy, surrounded by ceremony and shielded by fear. No one accused him directly while he lived. Instead, the rumors leaked sideways, into the records of ministers, into court poetry, into the dry footnotes of bureaucratic memos that all hint at the same thing. Something was wrong in the palace, but no one had the power to name it. What's more disturbing is how normalized it all became. By the end of his reign, Emperor Xiaowu had institutionalized a system where blood relation was no barrier to intimacy. In fact, it may have been a feature. Consorts of royal birth were safer, less politically threatening, and easier to control. They didn't come with foreign families, ambitious uncles, or rival claims. In a perverse way, family became the safest pool from which to draw companions. The empire, after all, was a family business. But power never stays still, and the consequences of his rule would be felt most directly by his son, the already infamous Qianfei, who inherited not only the throne, but the entire twisted architecture of Xiaowu's personal court. The son didn't invent the chaos, he simply gave it a name. Emperor Xiaowu died in 464 CE, allegedly poisoned by his own son, just months after appointing him heir. And in that death, we find one of those cold ironies history is so fond of. A man who turned kinship into currency, undone by the one person who understood that logic better than anyone, his own blood. And yet, for all the quiet improprieties of Liu Song China, nothing quite prepares us for what happens when Rome decides to stop hiding. The next royal pair didn't need whispers. They were loud, visible, and legally wed, in full view of the empire, and one of them was already famous for surviving her last imperial husband, the other her uncle. 8. Claudius, Roman Emperor, and Agrippina the Younger. By the time Claudius married Agrippina the Younger in 49 AD, he had already seen enough of Rome to know that the line between survival and scandal was paper-thin and usually flammable. He was no romantic, no naive groom led by the heart. Claudius was an emperor by accident, a historian by nature, and a pragmatist by design. So when he took his own niece as his fourth wife, he did it with eyes wide open. He understood the optics. He understood the law. He just decided the empire was worth the fallout. And it was Agrippina who made sure the empire came with her. She was not new to palace life. Daughter of Germanicus, great-granddaughter of Augustus, sister of Caligula, and mother to the boy who would become Nero, Agrippina had royalty flowing through her veins like mercury, potent, dangerous, and impossible to contain. She'd been married twice before, born a son, been exiled by her own brother, and survived the bloodbath that was early imperial Rome. By the time she set her sights on Claudius, she was already one of the most powerful women in the empire, without a throne. She intended to change that. Their marriage was, in many ways, an alliance dressed in silk. Claudius needed stability. His previous wife, Messalina, had allegedly plotted against him, and the court was still twitching from the fallout. Agrippina, meanwhile, needed legitimacy, not for herself, but for her son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, better known to history as Nero. Marrying the emperor gave her the leverage she needed to position Nero as the next heir, bypassing Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. But first, there was a problem. The law. Uncle-niece marriages were taboo under Roman custom, not explicitly illegal, but frowned upon enough to cause political nausea. Roman society was conservative in all the ways that made hypocrisy a national sport. Public virtue was everything, even if private conduct resembled a play written by Jupiter on a bender. So, to make the marriage happen, Claudius passed a special law allowing uncles to marry their nieces under certain conditions, primarily when it was politically convenient. The Senate groaned, moralists wagged fingers, but no one stopped him, because everyone understood what was really happening. The emperor was marrying the empire's most connected widow in order to graft her lineage onto his legacy, and in doing so, he handed her the keys to the palace. Agrippina did not wait politely to be invited in. She was a force of nature in pearl earrings. She had Claudius name Nero as heir. She orchestrated his adoption into the Julio-Claudian line. She secured his betrothal to Claudius's daughter. She reshaped the palace staff. She installed allies. She had coins minted with her face, unprecedented for a living empress. She was not just consort, she was co-sovereign, and Claudius for a time tolerated it, maybe even admired it. He was not a fool. He'd written books on Roman history, studied laws, watched his predecessors fall to knives and poisons. He understood that Agrippina's ambition, though sharp-edged, was stabilizing. The court, under her hand, became efficient, orderly, almost serene, if you didn't mind the quiet vanishing of rivals. But then came the rumors that Agrippina was overstepping, that Nero was growing too bold, that Claudius was rethinking his succession plans. Some accounts claim he began warming again to Britannicus. Others suggest he grew uneasy with the sheer amount of power Agrippina wielded. He reportedly joked that he should write a new edict allowing husbands to divorce their nieces. A clever line, unless you were married to one. In 54 AD, Claudius died. Sudden illness, mushrooms, a suspicious timeline. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio all suggest poison, administered by Agrippina, of course, with the kind of dramatic flair only ancient historians could dream up. A dish of deadly fungi slipped into an imperial supper, a slow death masked by ceremony. Was it true? Maybe, maybe not. But the point wasn't whether it happened. The point was that everyone believed it could, because that was Agrippina's legacy. She didn't just blur the lines between family and politics, she weaponized them. She turned kinship into policy, marriage into dynasty, and for one shining, sinister moment, she made Rome hers. The irony, of course, is that all her effort to elevate Nero would eventually backfire. But that's a story for another segment. What matters here is that Claudius, the limping scholar emperor mocked for his stammer and his stoop, made the most audacious dynastic move of his life, not on the battlefield, but in the bedroom, by marrying his niece, not in secret, not in shame, but by law, and in full view of a Senate too tired to protest. Still, if Claudius and Agrippina made taboo a matter of legal paperwork, the next couple on our journey never even pretended to disguise their bond. In their kingdom, marrying your sibling wasn't a scandal, it was a feature. Because the next royal lovers weren't Roman or even Chinese, they were Egyptian, and their wedding vows were not made in secret. They were carved into stone. 9. Ptolemy II Philadelphus, Egypt, and Arsinoe II. In most cultures, marriage is a joining of families. In Ptolemaic Egypt, it was often a reunion, because when you're trying to build a god-king dynasty out of foreign roots and fragile legitimacy, who better to marry than someone who shares your divine blood and maybe your childhood memories? So when Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the second ruler of the Greek-speaking Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, married his full sister Arsinoe II, the reaction wasn't scandal, it was policy. To be fair, it wasn't common even among Greeks. Back in Macedon, from which the Ptolemies hailed, sibling marriage was neither practiced nor admired. Alexander the Great, though he set the stage for dynastic divinity, never married his sisters. That kind of union was generally left to the realm of mythology. But in Egypt, particularly under the pharaonic model, it was a different story. The gods of Egypt married their siblings. Isis married Osiris, Shu married Tefnut. Royal siblings who married one another weren't violating custom. They were participating in a divine archetype. For the native Egyptian population, it was familiar, even sacred. The Ptolemies, despite being ethnically Greek, understood the value of dressing in Egyptian traditions when it suited them. And so, Ptolemy II didn't just marry Arsinoe II, he deified their union. Let's rewind. Arsinoe II was no passive royal bride. She was a veteran of dynastic politics, a queen twice over before she even returned to Egypt. Her first marriage had been to Lysimachus, one of Alexander's generals, and her second, a political disaster, was to her half-brother Ptolemy Karaunos, who had murdered her sons and seized the Macedonian throne. By the time she fled back to Egypt, she had experience, authority, and an axe to grind. Ptolemy II, her younger brother, had become king in 283 BCE. His reign was defined by massive cultural investment, the expansion of the Library of Alexandria, construction of temples, patronage of scholars and poets. He styled himself as a Greek intellectual and an Egyptian pharaoh, a man of dual identity, ruling two overlapping worlds. When Arsinoe arrived in Alexandria, the city was still young, but already humming with power. She wasn't just returning home, she was inserting herself into the very heart of the dynasty. And soon enough, she was not just the king's sister, but his queen. They were both children of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's most cunning successors, and Berenice, a former lady-in-waiting who had parlayed charm into queenship. Their shared lineage wasn't a footnote, it was the foundation of their power. By marrying each other, they weren't just uniting royal bloodlines, they were folding the dynasty inward, sealing it like a closed loop, a political Ouroboros. And if the marriage raised eyebrows among the Greek elite, the Ptolemies didn't care. They embraced it. In fact, they branded it. Ptolemy and Arsinoe took the epithet Philadelphoi, meaning sibling lovers or sibling adorers. Coins were minted with both of their faces. Statues were erected. They were worshipped as the Theoi Adelphoi, the sibling gods. This wasn't just spin. It was a carefully crafted ideological project. The Ptolemies weren't content to rule. They wanted to be eternal. But it wasn't only symbolic. Arsinoe wielded genuine power. She was named co-regent. She appeared in decrees. She accompanied her brother-husband on public occasions. In one surviving stele, her name is listed before his, a move so rare in ancient royal inscriptions that it still confounds scholars. She was not a wife in the shadows, she was an equal, and yet the alliance was always precarious. The Ptolemies may have sold it as divine destiny, but under the surface it was also a hedge against civil war. The dynasty was filled with half-brothers, rival claimants, assassins for hire. By marrying each other, Ptolemy II and Arsinoe II eliminated external threats and ensured that power stayed exactly where they wanted it, between themselves. Arsinoe died in 270 BCE. Her brother-husband outlived her by another 15 years, and he never remarried. Her image remained on coins, her cult remained active, her influence lingered in the administration. She was remembered not just as a queen, but as a co-ruler, and perhaps the true architect of their joint reign. Modern historians debate whether their relationship was fully romantic, politically necessary, or something stranger still, a public performance of sacred kingship that blurred every line. But to the people of Egypt, it didn't need to make sense in modern terms. The pharaoh and his sister wife were living gods. Logic had nothing to do with it. Still, even among the Ptolemies, that famously self-consuming house of crowned cousins, this sibling union was just the beginning. Because if you thought one set of siblings was bold, the next couple took that family policy and multiplied it. A civil war, a royal love triangle, a king who married not one but two of his sisters and then went to war with both. 10. Ptolemy VI and Cleopatra II. By the time Ptolemy VI married his sister Cleopatra II, Egypt had already seen a few generations of royal couples keeping it in the family. To the Ptolemies, it was no longer shocking, it was expected. If the rest of the Mediterranean world rolled its eyes at the royal siblings' wedding, no one in Alexandria blinked. In fact, the real scandal didn't come from their union. It came later, when their marriage collapsed into civil war and their other sibling joined the fray. But first, the ceremony. Ptolemy VI Philometor, whose name means mother-loving, was still a teenager when he married Cleopatra II in the early 170s BCE. She was likely only slightly older, his full sister, daughter of Ptolemy V and Cleopatra I. Their marriage was both a continuation and a reinforcement of dynastic strategy. Marry a sibling, consolidate legitimacy, and elevate the royal bloodline into something approaching the divine. If their parents had done it, and their grandparents before them, who were they to break the chain? The union was announced with fanfare. Coins were minted, statues carved. The Ptolemies had become so comfortable with sibling marriage that by this point their court historians had stopped even pretending it was unusual. The language of mythology, Isis and Osiris, divine consorts, twin souls, wrapped around the couple like a protective veil. The fiction of godhood made their decisions not just acceptable, but sacred. For a while the match held. Ptolemy VI ruled as king, Cleopatra II as queen. Their images appeared together on official documents. Their reign was marked by efforts at stability in a region that was increasingly less stable. Rome was rising. The Seleucid Empire to the northeast was flexing its muscles, and within Egypt internal tensions simmered as the economy stumbled and court factions sharpened their knives. The couple had children, one of whom, another Cleopatra, would later become infamous in her own right. But no amount of divine rhetoric could insulate them from what was coming, because this wasn't a love story, it was a prelude to chaos. In 164 BCE, Ptolemy VI was briefly deposed. His brother, Ptolemy VIII Euergetes II, younger, ambitious, and less subtle in his tactics, seized power with the help of Roman diplomacy. But in a classic twist of dynastic logic, the solution was not to remove him from the picture, it was to add him to it. Soon after Ptolemy VI was restored to the throne, the three siblings, Ptolemy VI, Cleopatra II, and Ptolemy VIII, began what can only be described as a royal ménage à trahison. All three ruled jointly. Cleopatra II remained married to her brother Ptolemy VI, while Ptolemy VIII lurked at the edges, playing both ally and threat. The political arrangement was fragile and held together more by exhaustion than trust. In 145 BCE, the tension snapped. Ptolemy VI died suddenly. Battlefield wound or quiet poisoning accounts vary, and Ptolemy VIII took the opportunity he'd been waiting for. He declared himself king, and then, in a move that would have made the most cynical courtier drop their goblet, he married Cleopatra II, his dead brother's widow, who was also his sister. To be clear, Ptolemy VIII had just married the same sister his brother had married. Cleopatra II now held the unusual distinction of having been queen consort to two full brothers in succession. And her new husband wasn't content with just one family connection. Within a few years, he also took her daughter, his own niece, as a second wife. That daughter, Cleopatra III, would go on to play her own role in this dynastic theatre of spirals and knives. But we'll get to her later. The marriage between Ptolemy VIII and Cleopatra II quickly deteriorated. In public, they maintained the rituals of divine royalty. In private, they began plotting against one another. Cleopatra II eventually led a full rebellion, declaring her own son king and seizing control of Alexandria. For a brief moment, she ruled Egypt alone, a rare feat for a woman in antiquity, even one from a royal house built on incest and audacity. Ptolemy VIII responded with characteristic cruelty. The conflict escalated into what historians call the Ptolemaic Civil War. Not a war of ideologies, but of siblings who had once shared a cradle and now sent assassins instead of birthday gifts. Propaganda flew in all directions. Temples were looted, cities burned. Cleopatra II was eventually forced to flee, taking refuge abroad before returning to Egypt years later, under a forced reconciliation that no one believed. The union that had once been marketed as sacred had collapsed into spectacle. Brother married sister, then brother married sister's daughter, then war, then exile, then compromise. And through it all, the Ptolemaic dynasty continued to insist that this was divine order, not dynastic dysfunction. But even within their own logic, the boundaries were beginning to strain. And still, there was one more twist in the spiral. Because while Cleopatra II had been caught in a tug-of-war between two brothers, the next woman on our list didn't wait to be claimed. She became both sister and queen, twice, and passed her throne like an heirloom from mother to daughter. The family tree didn't just twist, it doubled back on itself, with every branch marrying another. 11. Ptolemy VIII, Physcon Ptolemy VIII. Euergetes II, nicknamed Physcon, meaning fatty in Greek, which tells you everything you need to know about how beloved he was by the Alexandrian elite, did not enter the stage of history so much as belly flop into it. He was the third son of Ptolemy V and the younger brother of Ptolemy VI, whom he succeeded not by bloodless inheritance, but through a series of overlapping power grabs, familial betrayals, and what can only be described as ancient Egypt's most dysfunctional group chat. You've already met Cleopatra II, his full sister, who was previously married to their older brother Ptolemy VI, and who, after her first husband's sudden death, found herself married again to her surviving sibling. To the outside world, it may have looked like a strange but stable transfer of power. But stability had long since packed its bags and left the Ptolemaic palace. What followed was less a marriage than a dynastic hostage situation in slow motion. Ptolemy VIII had always been the third wheel in his family's triangle of power. While Ptolemy VI and Cleopatra II ruled jointly for years, Ptolemy VIII was kept on the political fringe, technically a co-ruler, but treated more like a tolerated guest at his own family's dinner table. When he seized the throne outright in 145 BCE, following Ptolemy VI's death, he wasted no time consolidating power, and part of that consolidation involved claiming his sister, Cleopatra II, as his queen. That was scandalous enough. But then came Cleopatra III. She was Cleopatra II's daughter, the child of her previous marriage to Ptolemy VI, and therefore Ptolemy VIII's niece by blood and his stepdaughter by marriage. By taking Cleopatra III as his wife and co-queen, Ptolemy VIII effectively married into his own sister's nuclear family. To make matters worse, and in this particular household that was always the direction things were heading, he didn't divorce Cleopatra II. He kept both women as wives simultaneously. And for the first time in the dynasty's already tangled history, two queens bore the same name, lived in the same palace, and vied for the same political influence over the same man who was both brother and uncle. The situation went from awkward to apocalyptic. Cleopatra III, younger and more ambitious, quickly rose in favor. Ptolemy VIII doted on her, deferred to her, and eventually began grooming their children for succession. Cleopatra II, once the Queen of Egypt in her own right, found herself politically marginalized and personally humiliated. She was not just replaced, she was replaced by her own daughter, in a marriage that made family dinners a logistical and moral nightmare. This was not a quiet feud. By 132 BCE, Cleopatra II had had enough. She declared her husband, brother, nephew, son-in-law an enemy of the state, raised an army, and seized control of Alexandria. In return, Ptolemy VIII and Cleopatra III fled to Cyprus. From there, the propaganda war began. Ptolemy VIII, who was never known for subtlety, responded to the rebellion with brutality. Ancient sources accuse him of horrific retaliations, purging intellectuals, executing political enemies, and allegedly sending Cleopatra II a gruesome birthday gift involving the dismembered body of her own son. Whether this was true or just effective slander by later chroniclers, the fact that it was plausible tells you everything about the family mood. And yet, even this explosive civil war didn't break the dynasty. After years of bitter conflict, the three royals reached an uneasy reconciliation. Cleopatra II returned to the palace. Cleopatra III kept her position, and Ptolemy VIII resumed ruling, as if the last decade hadn't been one long, blood-soaked holiday dinner gone wrong. Somehow the kingdom limped forward. The Ptolemaic dynasty, already infamous for its pattern of sibling marriages, had now entered a new phase, not just incestuous but recursive, where one generation's niece became the next generation's queen, and daughters replaced mothers in thrones and beds alike. It was a closed loop of power, sealed by blood and ritual, and made tolerable only by the myth of divine right. Even the name Cleopatra became less of a name and more of a title, passed like a crown, as though repeating it could ward off the family's accelerating collapse. In the end, Ptolemy VIII outlived them all. He died in 116 BCE, bloated with titles, enemies, and contradictions. Cleopatra III ruled alongside their son. Cleopatra II, older and wearier, faded from view. The dynasty, though battered, endured, long enough to give the world the Cleopatra everyone remembers. But before her, there were these Cleopatras, sisters, daughters, nieces, wives, sometimes all at once. And if this sounds like the height of dynastic entanglement, hold that thought. Because the next sibling pair on our list didn't just inherit this legacy, they doubled down. They were Cleopatra's ancestors too, and their marriage would become so infamous, so grotesquely circular, that even the ancients flinched. Because next comes a king who married his sister, and then married her daughter. 12. Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VIII. In most dynasties, history happens in linear fashion. Kings follow queens, sons follow fathers, wives become widows, power moves forward. But in the Ptolemaic dynasty, time curled back on itself like a cobra, swallowing its tail. Queens were recycled, sisters became stepmothers, nieces became wives, and in the rare cases where family members weren't sleeping together, they were probably assassinating each other. If it sounds repetitive, that's because it was. And no one lived the full circular nightmare of Ptolemaic royal life quite like Cleopatra II. She wasn't just a queen, she was the sister wife of one king, the sister wife of another, the mother of a queen, and the co-ruler of at least two men who were either her siblings or descendants. If Egyptian royalty had punch cards, hers would have been maxed out by 130 BCE. We've already seen her married to Ptolemy VI, her full brother, in a union designed to continue the now standard practice of dynastic sibling marriage. They ruled together with relative stability for a time, and their marriage produced children, among them Cleopatra III, who would later become a queen in her own right. That was Act 1. Then came Ptolemy VIII Physcon, Cleopatra II's younger brother, nicknamed by the Alexandrians for his girth and cruelty, not necessarily in that order. After Ptolemy VI's sudden death, suspicious circumstances always, Cleopatra II married Ptolemy VIII, making her the wife of two full brothers in succession, a feat that even by Ptolemaic standards raised a few eyebrows, then lowered them again in resignation. Their marriage at first was sold with the usual fanfare: sibling gods, divine union, political stability. But anyone who had been paying attention knew better. Ptolemy VIII didn't do stability. He did opportunism. He also didn't do monogamy, at least not the normal kind, because in the ultimate act of dynastic recursion, Ptolemy VIII married Cleopatra III, the daughter of Cleopatra II, and his late brother Ptolemy VI. In other words, he married his niece and his stepdaughter, and yes, his wife's daughter, all at once. And he didn't divorce Cleopatra II. He kept both women in the palace, side by side, equal in name, but not in influence. Cleopatra III was younger, more politically ambitious, and soon more beloved by Ptolemy VIII. Cleopatra II was left to watch as her daughter supplanted her, not just emotionally, but administratively. Cleopatra III began to issue edicts. She co-signed royal decrees. She appeared more prominently in palace ceremonies, and her children were elevated above those of Cleopatra II. It was the sort of arrangement that would have made even the gods roll their eyes. For Cleopatra II, it was more than an insult. It was an existential threat. She had ruled as queen, mothered a future monarch, and served as co-regent with two brothers. Now she was being eclipsed, not by a foreign rival, scheming outsider, but by her own daughter in her own palace, married to her own brother-husband. The tension turned into action. In 132 BCE, Cleopatra II launched a rebellion, not a secret plot, not whispered discontent, a full-scale civil war. She seized Alexandria, declared her own son Ptolemy Memphites king, and forced Ptolemy VIII and Cleopatra III to flee Egypt entirely. For a brief period, Cleopatra II ruled alone, an unprecedented move in a dynasty full of co-regents and power-sharing. She was a woman who had been sister to one king, wife to two, and now sovereign in her own right. But, as always in the Ptolemaic court, power was never safe for long. Ptolemy VIII regrouped in Cyprus, then returned with an army. What followed was a back and forth of territory propaganda and bloodshed. Some sources allege that Ptolemy VIII retaliated by murdering Cleopatra II's son and sending her the body, a story so grim it veers into myth, but which underscores the sheer toxicity of their family dynamic. And yet they reconciled. Yes, after years of civil war, murder, and mutual betrayal, Cleopatra II rejoined her brother-husband and her daughter in a formal restoration of the triadic monarchy. The propaganda machine fired back up. Coins were reissued. Public rituals resumed. Alexandria pretended nothing had happened. Why? Because in a dynasty that had erased the boundary between family and state, reconciliation wasn't personal. It was practical. Keeping power in the family meant sometimes sharing it with your enemies, even if those enemies shared your DNA. Cleopatra II eventually faded from public life, replaced by her daughter in both title and influence. But her legacy endured, not as a helpless queen swept up in her brother's madness, but as a political survivor in a house that devoured its own. And just when you think the spiral has hit bottom, that sibling marriage, niece marriage, and daughter stealing must surely be the apex of dynastic absurdity, history slides over a new scroll, one where a king doesn't just marry his sister, but later adds her daughter to the mix too, just to make sure the family tree folds in half. Because next comes a monarch who didn't just follow tradition, he perfected it. 13. Mithridates VI of Pontus and Laodice. By the time Mithridates VI of Pontus married his sister Laodice, he wasn't just participating in royal tradition, he was perfecting a model of kingship that wrapped family, power, and myth into a single, indestructible knot. And if that knot included a full sibling marriage, well, that was less an aberration than an inheritance. Mithridates VI, later known as Mithridates the Great, ruled the kingdom of Pontus in northern Anatolia from roughly 120 BCE to 63 BCE. He was a polyglot, a pharmacologist, a self-proclaimed second coming of Alexander the Great, and a deep believer in the art of survival. He was also a man raised in a royal house that considered sibling marriage not scandalous, but sacred. Pontus, though technically Hellenistic in language and administration, had long absorbed Persian and Anatolian customs. Among those customs was the Achaemenid tradition of dynastic endogamy, the practice of royal siblings marrying each other to preserve divine bloodlines and eliminate external claims to power. In this world, a sibling wasn't just a relative. A sibling was a mirror, a purified reflection of your right to rule. Laodice, Mithridates' sister, was reportedly beautiful, educated, and politically competent. Their marriage wasn't the result of lust or improvisation. It was premeditated policy, a return to Achaemenid ideals filtered through the lens of Greek theatrics. Together, they were styled as godlike. Joint coins bore their images. Laodice, unusually for a queen consort of the region, appeared in public in royal regalia. In some inscriptions, she was referred to with honorifics normally reserved for ruling monarchs. She wasn't simply the king's wife, she was his counterpart. But if this all sounds strangely romantic, don't get too comfortable. The house of Mithridates, like the house of the Ptolemies, was a place where blood flowed as easily as titles. Marrying your sister might keep the royal bloodline pure, but it didn't guarantee peace. Over time, the relationship between Mithridates and Laodice began to fracture, politically, personally, maybe even existentially. Sources from antiquity are fragmented, and much of what we know about Mithridates comes from Roman authors who viewed him with suspicion, contempt, and occasionally awe. To them, he was the exotic enemy, a man who defied Rome for decades, outfoxed generals, and inspired both fear and fascination. He was the Poison King, rumored to have immunized himself against toxins with daily microdoses. The kind of man, in short, who could plausibly be accused of anything and everything, including betrayal, patricide, sororicide, and worse. What's more concrete is this. By the end of their relationship, Laodice was no longer by Mithridates' side. Some accounts suggest she conspired against him. Others claim he had her executed. Others still imply she simply disappeared from the record, consumed by the unstoppable machinery of Mithridates' later military campaigns. Whether she died by intrigue or exile, her memory was erased in the same way so many royal women were, selectively, strategically, and with just enough ambiguity to keep historians squinting for centuries. But the importance of their union lies less in its outcome than in what it symbolized. This wasn't a love story. It was a blueprint. Mithridates VI would go on to marry multiple other women, many of them his cousins, all of them from noble or royal lineages. His daughters, too, were caught in the dynastic web. One was married off to a cousin, another to a Scythian king, and still others were kept at court, not merely as princesses, but as tools of consolidation. And when his empire began to collapse under the weight of Rome's expansion, Mithridates turned inward. In one of the most tragic ironies of his life, the man who had built his power on blood would see that bloodline disintegrate from within. His sons rebelled, his wives plotted, his daughters were captured. One of his own sons would eventually betray him to Rome. The very web he had spent decades weaving began to snap. But in his early marriage to Laodice, we see the core logic of his reign, that the most reliable bond was the one forged in family, no matter how close. That loyalty was hereditary. That power, like royalty itself, should be kept in the blood. The world around him didn't always agree. The Romans found sibling marriage bizarre, the Greeks decadent, the Anatolian nobility occasionally useful, but for Mithridates it was both a message and a mechanism. I am not like you. I do not need your rules. My crown is older than your republic. And if Mithridates and Laodice turned sibling marriage into a tool of cultural resistance, the next royal in our journey inherited that idea and escalated it. He didn't just marry one sister. According to ancient accounts, he married two, simultaneously, in full defiance of both Persian and Greek moralities, because for him, the line between royal and god was drawn with ink and then erased. 14. Cambyses II, Achaemenid Persia. If sibling marriage in royal houses was often a strategy, a maneuver played under the guise of divinity or dynastic purity, then Cambyses II took the script, unrolled it, and burned it. Not to challenge the system, but to prove he was the system. Pharaoh, king, divine heir, son of Cyrus the Great, Cambyses didn't simply inherit an empire. He inherited the assumption that the rules were whatever he said they were. Which brings us to the controversy that has shadowed his reign since antiquity, that he married not one, but two of his own sisters, simultaneously, publicly, and possibly against the religious and legal traditions of his time. Or at least, that's what the Greeks said. Cambyses II ruled the Achaemenid Empire from roughly 530 to 522 BCE, a period during which Persia was rapidly expanding, swallowing Egypt, extending its grasp across the Near East, and constructing a bureaucratic system that would later inspire empires from Rome to the Ottomans. He succeeded his father, Cyrus the Great, the charismatic founder of the Persian Empire, and one of history's rare conquerors who managed to be both feared and widely admired. Cambyses, however, inherited something else, suspicion. Greek historians, especially Herodotus, were quick to contrast the legendary wisdom of Cyrus with the erratic, tyrannical image of his son. According to these sources, Cambyses wasn't just cruel or arrogant, he was unhinged, and the most enduring accusation, that he married his full sister and then another sister in direct violation of Persian law. Herodotus, writing a century later, claimed that Cambyses fell in love with one of his sisters and took her as his wife, despite strong opposition from the Persian elders. When told the marriage was illegal, Cambyses allegedly rewrote the law, declaring it permissible by royal decree. Later, he supposedly married a second sister as well, pushing the dynasty further into its own bloodstream. In typical Herodotean fashion, the story is embroidered with moral warnings, dramatic ironies, and the subtle glee of an outsider judging foreign kings by Greek standards. But how much of it is true? That's the enduring question. In Achaemenid tradition, there's some evidence, although still debated, that close kin marriages, including between half-siblings or cousins, might have been culturally tolerated among elites. Later Zoroastrian texts, written long after Cambyses' time, refer to a concept called exwe-dodar, the idea of sacred kin marriage to preserve spiritual and dynastic purity. But it's unclear whether this practice was in effect accepted or even codified during Cambyses' reign. What is clear is that the Greeks believed it, or more precisely, they wanted to believe it. Cambyses' conquest of Egypt, an ancient civilization with its own long-standing tradition of sibling marriage among pharaohs, made him an easy target for moral reversal. If the Greeks considered themselves rational, lawful, and moderate, then Cambyses became their literary foil, passionate, lawless, and irrational. His alleged incest was less about his actual policies and more about Greek anxieties. A foreign king who claimed godhood, rewrote laws, and married within his own lineage just because he could. According to the Greek accounts, Cambyses didn't stop at breaking moral boundaries. He allegedly killed one of his sisters, a detail often included to complete the arc from forbidden love to familial horror. Again, the historicity is uncertain, and modern scholars warn against taking these ancient accusations at face value. Herodotus, for all his storytelling brilliance, was writing for an audience that loved its Eastern kings, twisted and tragic. Still, the legend persisted. Cambyses became, in the classical imagination, a cautionary tale, a man whose hubris led him not just to political overreach, but to domestic taboo. The incest accusation wasn't just about personal scandal, it was an indictment of imperial excess, the idea that given enough power, a king would rewrite laws, marry his sisters, desecrate temples, and call it all divine right. But the irony is hard to ignore, because while the Greeks accused Cambyses of marrying his sisters in a fit of unhinged tyranny, the Egyptians, newly conquered under his reign, would have found nothing unusual about it. Their own pharaohs had done the same for centuries. To them, a royal sibling union wasn't obscene, it was sacred. Isis and Osiris, Geb and Nut, bloodline was destiny, and dynastic unity meant cosmic balance. Perhaps Cambyses, in adopting the practice, was doing what any savvy imperial ruler would do, blending customs, co-opting local theology, reinforcing his legitimacy through ritual. Or perhaps he truly did overstep, snapping tradition in half for reasons known only to him and his court. Either way, his story raises the same question that floats through so many dynastic incest rumors. Were they acts of love, strategy, or delusion? And who gets to decide which is which? Cambyses died under mysterious circumstances in 522 BCE. Some say suicide, others assassination, others a self-inflicted wound gone wrong. What's left behind is a legacy wrapped in contradiction, a ruler who may have absorbed both Persian and Egyptian models of kingship, and in doing so made himself unjudgeable by either. But if Cambyses was the outsider king who borrowed traditions and pushed boundaries, the next monarch in our journey was all in. No borrowing, no improvisation, just the full unapologetic practice of marrying not one but multiple daughters. Because in his kingdom, the family tree didn't just fork, it looped back toward the throne. 15. Ramesses II, Egypt. If you want to understand the logic behind royal incest, not the whispering scandal, but the sanctified, open-palmed kind, you don't need to dig through obscure court records or second-hand Greek gossip. You just need to walk into an ancient Egyptian temple. There, carved in granite and limestone, standing 30 feet tall, is a man named Ramesses II, also known as Ramesses the Great. He ruled for 66 years, fought wars, built cities, and declared himself a god. and carved beside him, in symmetrical stillness, are queens. Not just any queens, his daughters. Ramesses II didn't invent dynastic endogamy, he inherited it. Pharaohs marrying their sisters or daughters was a tradition older than papyrus. In Egyptian theology, the pharaoh wasn't just the ruler, he was the earthly manifestation of divine order, ma'at. To preserve that divine order, royal blood had to be protected, not metaphorically, literally. The gods married each other. Isis and Osiris were siblings and spouses, so their human incarnations, the pharaohs, followed suit. To marry outside the bloodline was to dilute not just royal power, but the cosmic harmony that Egypt believed held the world together. But even by these standards, Ramesses II was prolific. He came to power in the 13th century BCE, the third pharaoh of the 19th dynasty. His reign was long, almost absurdly so. He ruled from his early 20s until he was over 90, fathering more than 100 children and outliving many of them. He built colossal monuments across Egypt, the Ramesseum, the temples of Abu Simbel, the expanded Karnak complex. He carved his legacy into stone, sand, and sky. And in that legacy, he placed his daughters, not just as princesses, but as consorts. The most notable of these was Bintanath, his eldest daughter by Queen Isetnofret. She appears beside him in statues, inscriptions, and temple reliefs, not merely as a child of the king, but as his great royal wife, a title reserved for the queen consort. In one particularly striking depiction, she stands beside her father at Abu Simbel, nearly as tall as he is, wearing the vulture headdress of a queen, symbols of fertility and protection radiating from her carved form. Later daughters followed the same path. Meritamun, another of Ramesses' daughters, possibly by Queen Nefertari, also bore the title of queen and was buried in the Valley of the Queens, in a tomb decorated with scenes of the afterlife reserved for royals of the highest order. Nebetawi, yet another daughter, is likewise attested as a great royal wife, and while the precise details of these marriages, whether they were ceremonial, strategic, or conjugal, remain debated, the public presentation was unmistakable. These were not just royal children, they were the king's partners in sovereignty. To modern eyes, it's nearly impossible to separate this from taboo. But ancient Egypt did not share modern definitions of kinship, morality. For them, legitimacy wasn't about emotional boundaries, it was about cosmic alignment. The king was divine, his children were divine. The throne was not just inherited, it was maintained through ritual union, and that union sometimes meant marrying a daughter to preserve the purity of the god-king's bloodline. Ramesses wasn't alone in this. Earlier dynasties had practiced the same tradition, and later ones would echo it, but what sets him apart is the sheer visibility of it. He didn't obscure it, he immortalized it. On temples, stelae, tombs, he paraded his daughters as queens with full regalia, equal in status to his other wives, and at times even more prominently displayed. They weren't hidden in the back chambers of the palace. They were inscribed in public monuments, forever walking beside him into the afterlife. And there's a darker, more ironic twist to all this grandeur. For all his obsession with legacy, for all his efforts to inscribe his rule into eternity, Ramesses' dynasty didn't last. Within a few generations, Egypt was fractured, and the divine bloodlines he so carefully preserved were absorbed, replaced, or erased by foreign rulers. The titles meant nothing without the power to enforce them. Still, his legacy lingers, not just in statues and sand, but in the deeper question of what kingship means when it's constructed entirely within the family. Ramesses ruled as a father, a husband, a god, and sometimes all three at once. His daughters bore the crown not in shame, but as a public ritual of royal perfection. And that image of a king who married his daughters and carved their shared rule in stone would echo for centuries. But if Egypt could normalize such unions through theology and tradition, Europe would go a different route. Their royal incest was less about cosmic alignment and more about dynastic consolidation, quietly rationalized in family trees and papal dispensations. And one Habsburg emperor in particular would take this strategy to its literal limit by marrying someone who was not just his niece but his cousin, twice over. 16. Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, and Margaret Teresa of Spain. By the time Leopold I married Margaret Teresa of Spain in 1666, the Habsburg dynasty had already turned family into a mirror. Every marriage, every birth, every cross-border alliance repeated the same pattern. One cousin wed another, producing a child whose bloodline looped inward like a Baroque spiral staircase. They called it dynastic strategy. Modern historians call it genetic roulette, and in Leopold's case, that strategy led him straight to his teenage niece, a girl who was, by Habsburg standards, practically predestined to be his bride. Leopold was born in Vienna in 1640, the second son of Ferdinand III. Initially groomed for the church, a common path for imperial spares, he was rerouted toward kingship after the death of his older brother. Pious, scholarly, and awkward, Leopold didn't look like a typical emperor. He looked like someone who read about emperors in books and took notes. But his most important asset wasn't his temperament or military skill. It was his blood, pure Habsburg through and through. And Margaret Teresa, she was his niece, the daughter of his older sister Maria Anna and King Philip IV of Spain, which also made her his first cousin, since Philip IV was Leopold's own uncle. In other words, Margaret was Leopold's niece and cousin simultaneously. Their family tree didn't branch, it circled. The union was political, of course. The Spanish Habsburgs and Austrian Habsburgs had been engaged in the world's longest game of matrimonial chess since the 16th century, seeking to preserve their joint inheritance by reducing it to a single family. But with the Spanish line faltering, politically and genetically, pressure mounted to secure the throne through a marriage that would tie both branches together one final time. Enter Leopold, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Margaret Teresa, barely 15. The match was proposed early, delayed for years due to diplomatic complications, and finalized under the mounting anxiety that Spain's royal house might collapse altogether. The dowry negotiations dragged on. Spain was bankrupt again, but ultimately the deal was made. A treaty was signed, a proxy marriage held, and Margaret departed Madrid for Vienna. The two had never met. Leopold, then 26, received his young bride with pomp and caution. Despite the familial intimacy of their bloodlines, they had been raised in separate courts, in different languages, under different skies. Margaret arrived draped in Spanish formality, a product of the rigid etiquette and black-clad piety of the Escorial court. Leopold, for all his shyness, had been steeped in the multi-ethnic bureaucracy of the Holy Roman Empire. Their union wasn't just a marriage, it was a collision of two branches of the same decaying tree. Still, there was affection, of a kind. Leopold reportedly treated Margaret with respect, even gentleness. He called her the darling of my heart in letters. They shared an interest in music and religious devotion, but the shadow of dynastic pressure hung heavy over their palace. Margaret's primary role was not companionship, it was reproduction, and here the Habsburgs ran into the limits of their strategy. Margaret gave birth to 4 children, but only one, a daughter, survived infancy. The rest, born into bodies twisted by generations of endogamy, died within months or years. Meanwhile, Margaret's health began to fail. By her early 20s, she was weak, frequently ill, and suffering from what court physicians delicately termed exhaustion. By 1673, just 7 years into the marriage, she was dead. She was only 21. Leopold was reportedly devastated. He commissioned portraits, held memorial services. For all the cold arithmetic of the marriage, it appears that real affection had bloomed, though perhaps too late to make a difference. But the dynastic machine didn't stop. With Margaret gone, Leopold remarried. To whom? Another close relative, Claudia Felicitas of Tyrol, his first cousin once removed, later to Eleanor Magdalene of Neuburg, also from within the sprawling web of Catholic royalty. The Habsburgs were not in the habit of learning lessons. The genetic consequences of these marriages would become grotesquely clear in the next generation. Margaret Theresa's half-brother, Charles II of Spain, born of an uncle-niece union, would go on to become the most medically infamous monarch in European history. His reign was defined not by power, but by the visible collapse of the dynasty's gene pool, and that collapse had been decades in the making. Leopold and Margaret's marriage is often overshadowed by what came after, but it represents the turning point, the moment when dynastic logic finally began to outweigh human reality, when the desire to preserve royal blood overtook the ability to protect human life. It was, in many ways, a love story, but one written in the margins of a treaty, signed in a cousin's handwriting, and sealed with a signature that looked eerily like a mirror. And if you think marrying your niece and cousin at once is extreme, wait until you see who picked up the torch in Spain. Because the next royal on our list didn't just continue the tradition, he married a girl who was his niece by law and his first cousin by blood, and he wasn't even the first in his family to do it. 17. Philip II of Spain and Anna of Austria. If you were writing a tragicomic opera about royal genetics, you'd probably invent someone like Philip II of Spain. Tireless, solemn, fanatically devout, ruler of an empire so vast that the sun really didn't set on it, and yet utterly shackled by the house that built him. A Habsburg through and through, and when the time came for Philip to choose his fourth wife, he didn't look outside Europe. He didn't even look outside his family. He married Anna of Austria, who was both his niece and his first cousin. And no, that's not a typo. She was both, because in the House of Habsburg, genealogy wasn't a tree, it was a Mobius strip. By 1570, when Philip married Anna, he was 43 years old and already on his fourth wife. His first wife had been Maria Manuela of Portugal, his first cousin. His second was Queen Mary I of England, not a blood relative for once, but politically necessary and spiritually exhausting. His third wife was Elizabeth of Valois, the daughter of the French king. That marriage had been somewhat of a surprise. The French weren't Habsburgs, but it produced daughters, one of whom would later become the tragic Queen of France, Elizabeth of Spain. But Elizabeth of Valois died young, and Philip, a widower again at 42, needed a son, a male heir, preferably one with unimpeachable royal credentials, meaning a Habsburg. Enter Anna of Austria. Anna was the daughter of Maximilian II, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was both Philip's cousin and his brother-in-law. Anna's mother was Maria of Spain, Philip's own sister. So Anna was Philip's niece through his sister and his cousin through his uncle. In modern genetic terms, they shared more DNA than some siblings. In Habsburg terms, it was Tuesday. To us, this seems like the plot twist in a bad family drama. But to the Spanish court, it was a masterstroke. Anna had impeccable bloodlines. She was politically safe, no meddling in-laws with competing claims. She was raised in the same Catholic traditions as Philip, and most importantly, she was young, just 20. So Philip married her, without irony, without shame, with the full blessing of the Habsburg family machine, which by this point had been marrying cousins and nieces for so long that the question wasn't why would he, but who else could he? The marriage was, by all accounts, affectionate. Anna was cheerful, intelligent, and well-liked at court, a breath of fresh air in the austere corridors of Philip's rigid, monastic regime. She played games with her children, learned Spanish quickly, and apparently found her uncle husband more endearing than terrifying. A low bar, perhaps, but not insignificant in a palace where laughter was rare. Between 1571 and 1578, Anna bore Philip 5 children, 4 sons, one daughter. Finally, the Habsburgs had their long-desired male heir. Philip III of Spain was born in 1578, the culmination of generations of consanguineous planning. Unfortunately, the price of that planning was already becoming visible. While Anna had relatively robust health compared to other Habsburg brides, her children were less fortunate. Several of them died in infancy. Only Philip III survived to adulthood, a man who would later rule Spain with all the genetic vigor of someone born to an uncle-niece union. Anna herself died at just 30 years old. Postpartum complications, exhaustion, a lifetime of expectation folded into a decade of childbearing. No one is entirely sure. What's clear is that Philip mourned her deeply. She was his favorite wife, his last wife, and, thanks to the unique configuration of Habsburg DNA, his niece-daughter-in-law cousin hybrid, all rolled into one. But for all the solemnity of Philip's personal grief, the political machine kept turning. Anna's son, Philip III, inherited the Spanish crown in 1598, and, in keeping with family tradition, he would go on to marry his own cousin, who also happened to be the sister of the man who married his sister. The Habsburgs didn't so much pair off as loop in circles. What Philip II's marriage to Anna of Austria reveals is the tipping point of dynastic strategy into biological gamble. By the late 16th century, the Habsburgs weren't just marrying relatives out of tradition, they were doing it out of necessity. The political boundaries were drawn so tightly that no one outside the family could be trusted. The result was an echo chamber of alliances and, inevitably, consequences, and those consequences would arrive with brutal clarity in the next generation. Philip II's grandson, the son of yet another uncle-niece marriage, would be born with a jawline that could stop a clock, a body riddled with inherited disorders, and a reign that became a living autopsy of dynastic inbreeding. Because next comes the most infamous product of Habsburg family planning, a man who was less a king than a cautionary tale, and whose face said everything you needed to know about marrying your niece. 18. Ferdinand VII of Spain and Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies. By the early 19th century, even the Habsburgs must have been sensing the smoke. Generations of uncle-niece marriages, cousin pairings, and dynastic recycling had produced a royal gene pool, less like a family tree and more like a family wreath, pretty on the outside, but closing in on itself. And yet they kept going. Not because they didn't know better, but because they believed that family meant control, that every crown should stay in Habsburg hands, even if it had to sit on a head wobbling from the weight of its own DNA. And so, in 1829, Ferdinand VII of Spain, already battered by age, illness, and political failure, married Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, who was not just his fourth wife, but his niece. Let's break that down. Ferdinand was born in 1784, the son of Charles IV of Spain and Maria Louisa of Parma. He grew up in a court divided by incompetence and corruption, saw his father deposed during Napoleon's occupation of Spain, and eventually clawed his way back to the throne in 1813, largely by appearing just ineffectual enough that neither the French nor the Spanish liberals took him seriously until it was too late. By the time he returned to power, Ferdinand had already been married 3 times. Each wife died without leaving him a surviving heir. And with the Bourbon dynasty hanging by a frayed thread, again, the pressure to produce a legitimate successor was overwhelming. Not just any heir, but a male one. The kind who could ensure Spain didn't fall into civil war the moment Ferdinand died. Enter Maria Cristina, daughter of Francis I of the Two Sicilies and Maria Isabella of Spain, who, for clarity's sake, was Ferdinand's sister. That made Maria Cristina his niece through his bloodline and his bride through dynastic necessity. The marriage was pushed through with urgency. Ferdinand was 45. Maria Cristina was 23. It was, in every sense, a last-ditch gamble. To the outside world, it was deeply uncomfortable. Even by royal standards, uncle-niece marriages were becoming harder to justify. The Enlightenment had happened. The French Revolution had decapitated the idea of divine right, and even conservative monarchies were beginning to see that marrying one's own niece might not be the PR win it once was. But Spain, or rather Ferdinand, had no time for modernity. He needed a child, and Maria Cristina was Habsburg enough to count, young enough to bear children, and politically unthreatening. She was a niece, yes, but she was also the last hope of the Spanish Bourbons. They were married on December the 11th, 1829, in a hurried ceremony that masked its anxiety with opulent ceremony. Almost immediately, the palace began to buzz with quiet panic. Could Maria Cristina conceive? Could she carry to term? Could she, in effect, save a collapsing bloodline with a womb that shared too much of that same blood? The answer, surprisingly, was yes, with caveats. In 1830, Maria Cristina gave birth to a daughter, Isabella II. Not the hoped-for male heir, but a child nonetheless. A Bourbon child. The immediate problem was solved. The long-term one, however, had just begun. Spain had a law, the Salic law, borrowed from France, that barred women from inheriting the throne. But Ferdinand, desperate to ensure his daughter's succession, revoked the law before his death in 1833. This set off a political bomb. His brother, Don Carlos, rejected the change and claimed the throne for himself. His supporters, the Carlists, launched a civil war that would torment Spain for years. In other words, by marrying his niece and producing a daughter, Ferdinand didn't solve the crisis of succession. He deepened it. The very child who was supposed to unite the kingdom became the center of its fracture. Maria Cristina, now Queen Regent, was left to govern a kingdom descending into chaos. She tried to balance factions, negotiate peace, and raise Isabella to rule. But the court never forgave her marriage, nor her secret remarriage to a guard officer just months after Ferdinand's death. The scandal compounded the whispers of incest and betrayal, casting Maria Cristina as a figure both maternal and dangerously ambitious. Yet history is rarely kind to women in impossible positions. Maria Cristina didn't create the conditions that led to her marriage. She simply fulfilled them. She was a niece raised to be an empress, trained in loyalty, and given one task: produce a child for a man twice her age who had nowhere else to turn. Ferdinand VII died in 1833, leaving behind a wife too young for widowhood, a daughter too young for queenship, and a country too divided to heal. His marriage to Maria Cristina, rationalized as political strategy, became the symbolic endpoint of the Habsburg-Bourbon experiment in dynastic entanglement. And if that sounds like the conclusion of a cursed lineage, don't worry, it wasn't. Because just a few decades earlier, another royal union had already quietly demonstrated that marrying your first cousin could still be romanticized, even idealized, as long as it was done in lace and empire silhouettes, and it all started with a girl named Victoria. 19. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. In the long echoing hall of royal marriages between cousins, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert are the most famously idealized. Draped in lace, cloaked in sentimentality, and immortalized in portraits where gazes linger just a bit too long, their union is often remembered as a love story that softened the iron edges of monarchy. And yet, beneath the carefully arranged romance of courtship and candlelight was something older and colder: dynastic design. Victoria and Albert were first cousins, both grandchildren of Francis, Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, and products of a long-standing tradition that saw cousin marriage not as scandalous, but as politically prudent. In fact, if you were a 19th century European royal, marrying a cousin wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Trust was scarce. Bloodlines were sacred, and nothing said dynastic stability like keeping the crown in the family, literally. Victoria was born in 1819. the daughter of Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, fourth son of George III, and Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. She was fifth in line at birth, but thanks to a series of untimely deaths and childless uncles, became heir presumptive at 11. Her upbringing was controlled, emotionally restricted, and rigidly ceremonial. Her mother, a German-born duchess with ambitious aims, kept her daughter isolated, heavily supervised, and painfully lonely, a recipe that often produces either rebellion or fierce dependency. Victoria chose the latter. Albert, born in the same year as Victoria, was raised in the tiny duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Groomed from childhood to be a consort, not a king, he was rigorously educated in languages, history, music, science, and, perhaps most importantly, etiquette. He was the ideal dynastic puzzle piece, intelligent, serious, and above all, safe. He wasn't just Victoria's cousin, he was her mirror. Equally noble, equally German, equally shaped by family duty. Their paths crossed first as teenagers. The encounter was polite, awkward, and orchestrated. Years later, Victoria would write in her diary that she found Albert extremely handsome, which, translated from the royal dialect of understatement, meant she was already halfway to yes. But it was Victoria who proposed. As Queen of England, she had the higher rank and the final say. In 1839, at the age of 20, she asked Albert to marry her. He accepted. Their wedding, held in February 1840, was designed to be both modern and mythic. Victoria wore a white dress, now standard bridal fare, but then a radical gesture of youthful purity. The gown was trimmed with Honiton lace, symbolizing domestic industry. The wedding was a public event, carefully choreographed to promote monarchy not as a cold institution, but as a human, relatable family. It worked, but beneath the lace was a web of calculation. Their shared bloodline was no accident. Victoria and Albert's uncle, Leopold I of Belgium, had long orchestrated cousin marriages across European courts. He saw the union not just as romantic, but strategic, a means to knit together the Coburg line with the British Crown, consolidate Protestant monarchies, and ensure loyalty between empires increasingly defined by revolution and reform. The marriage, however, wasn't without friction. Victoria, raised to be singular, struggled to share power. Albert, despite being her equal in intellect, was legally her subject, a consort, not a king. Their early years were marked by tension over influence, protocol, and private agency. Victoria often resented Albert's insistence on being more than ornamental. Albert, in turn, grew increasingly frustrated with his role as perpetual second fiddle to a queen whose ministers barely tolerated his presence. Yet over time, Albert reshaped the monarchy from within. He advised on foreign policy, helped modernize court rituals, and took an active role in the arts and sciences. He was deeply involved in the organization of the Great Exhibition of 1851, a triumph of British industry and soft power. Behind the scenes, he helped reform education, prisons, and public health policy. He became the moral architect of Victorian Britain, not officially crowned, but ideologically entrenched. Their relationship evolved into something deeper than affection, a mutual dependency woven through with shared duty. They had 9 children, each married off to various European royal houses, earning Victoria the nickname Grandmother of Europe. The genetic consequences of this widespread cousin marrying were visible in subsequent generations, notably in the haemophilia that afflicted several of Victoria's descendants, including her son Leopold and members of the Russian and Spanish royal families. The disease, inherited through her lineage, became a quiet symbol of the costs of dynastic insularity. Albert died in 1861 at just 42. Victoria never recovered. She wore black for the rest of her life, retreated from public view for years, and transformed her mourning into a public brand of sacred grief. Her devotion was held up as proof of the union's sanctity, a narrative that covered over the dynasty's self-perpetuating loops with soft lighting and sentimental myth. But behind that myth was still a fact. This was a first-cousin marriage, designed as much for strategic continuity as for love. And while Victoria and Albert's court looked polished and modern on the surface, it carried within it the same ancient logic that had governed royal unions for centuries, one that blurred the line between affection and obligation, between governance and genealogy. And the practice didn't end with them, because the next royal couple on our list would echo their bond almost identically. Cousins once again, love and blood in equal measure, but this time in a different empire, one just beginning to feel the weight of its own coming decline. 20. Franz Joseph I, Austria, and Elizabeth Cece. If Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were the crown-wearing poster couple of industrial-age propriety, then Franz Joseph I and Elizabeth of Bavaria, better known as Cece, were their twilight counterparts. Tragic, photogenic, and increasingly out of step with the very empire they were meant to uphold. Their marriage was also a cousin match, not quite as genetically condensed as an uncle-niece pairing, but still squarely within the Habsburg tradition of keeping the bloodline neat, tidy, and at least slightly compromised. Franz Joseph, born in 1830, ascended the throne of the Austrian Empire at just 18. He would go on to rule for 68 years, a period of such breadth that it covered revolutions, world wars, and the eventual disappearance of the empire he once embodied. To the outside world, he represented imperial consistency, clean-shaven, stiff-collared, eternally composed. But that image, like so many royal facades, was curated around a much messier reality. And into that reality stepped Elizabeth, or Cece, a Bavarian duchess, daughter of Duke Maximilian of Bavaria and Princess Ludovica of Bavaria. Born in 1837, Cece was Franz Joseph's first cousin on his mother's side. She grew up far from the rigid world of Viennese court life, surrounded by horses, poetry, and the romantic chaos of a Bavarian household that prioritized eccentricity over protocol. Her upbringing was unpolished, and that was precisely what attracted Franz Joseph. Originally, the emperor had been intended to marry Cece's older sister, Helene, a perfectly suitable Habsburg-style match. She was elegant, educated, and obedient. But when the sisters were brought to court, Franz Joseph reportedly ignored Helene entirely. He was immediately captivated by the 15-year-old Cece, shy, unconventional, and entirely uninterested in imperial grandeur. Within days, he declared he would marry her. His mother, Archduchess Sophie, who also happened to be Cece's aunt, objected, but Franz Joseph overruled her. The wedding was arranged at imperial speed. They were married in 1854. Franz Joseph was 23. Cece had just turned 16. On the surface, the match was dynastic perfection. Cousins from noble houses, both Catholic, both fluent in the Habsburg vocabulary of tradition and spectacle. But underneath it all, the marriage was a clash of expectations so profound that it would haunt both of them for the rest of their lives. Franz Joseph, dutiful to the bone, expected his new wife to embrace the burdens of queenship, to produce heirs, uphold decorum, and serve as the maternal face of the monarchy. Cece, still more child than consort, recoiled. She was allergic to court life, loathed the endless ceremonies, and found herself smothered by the iron will of her mother-in-law Sophie, who immediately took charge of the royal household, including Cece's pregnancies. The empress gave birth to 4 children, including the long-awaited male heir, Crown Prince Rudolph. But even this achievement brought little peace. Sophie took control of the children's upbringing, often excluding Cece entirely. The empress spiraled into depression, eating disorders, and what would now be recognized as intense social anxiety. She fled Vienna for long periods, traveling compulsively across Europe and the Mediterranean, not for diplomacy, but for distance. And yet, Cece was adored by the public. Her waistline became legend, her hair routines the stuff of court gossip, her sorrow, cloaked in poetic language and veiled portraits, made her a kind of tragic celebrity. Meanwhile, Franz Joseph soldiered on, loyal, rigid, and increasingly alone. Despite the emotional distance, their bond never entirely snapped. Franz Joseph was never unfaithful, at least not openly. He respected Cece's need for freedom, even as he struggled to understand it. They exchanged letters throughout their long separations, written in an odd mix of longing and formality. He loved her. She resented the structure of being loved by a man who represented everything she wanted to escape. Their shared cousinage, though never directly cited as the cause of unhappiness, was part of a larger pattern, a royal system that prioritized family ties over personal compatibility, bloodlines over boundaries. Cece may have been his cousin, but she was never truly his partner. The match, like so many before and after it, was less about affection than genealogy, a suitable bride, a reproductive alliance, an aesthetically pleasing union that could be carved in marble and photographed for posterity. Tragedy followed them like a courtier. In 1889, their only son, Rudolf, died in a mysterious double suicide at Meierling, an event that shattered Cece and hollowed out the already brittle empire. Franz Joseph never recovered. Cece grew more reclusive. In 1898, she was assassinated in Geneva by an anarchist who simply wanted to kill someone important. She was 60. Franz Joseph, broken but still standing, ruled until 1916. Their marriage, like their empire, outlasted its usefulness. It was beautiful in portraiture, mournful in retrospect, and its story was repeated in different shades across nearly every European court where cousin marriage was not just common, but quietly required. But as royal cousin matches go, theirs was relatively gentle. The next couple, the king and queen of a newly unified nation, would bring back the old Habsburg habit of marrying first cousins, not just out of tradition, but national symbolism. Because when Italy needed to invent itself, it reached into its own blood. 21st, Umberto I of Italy and Margherita of Savoy. If Italy was late to the unification game, it was not late to the cousin marriage. The newly minted Kingdom of Italy, formed in the shadow of revolutions and Risorgimento fervor, needed to project ancient legitimacy through modern power. It needed grandeur, myth, lineage, and it needed it quickly. So when Umberto I, heir to the throne, married his first cousin, Margherita of Savoy, in 1868, it wasn't just a family affair. It was a dynastic branding exercise, broadcast to a fragmented nation that had only recently agreed to be one. The House of Savoy, unlike the Habsburgs or Bourbons, was relatively small, provincial and regional, a royal house without the long tentacles of a global empire. But what it lacked in scale, it tried to make up for in purity. And cousin marriage, that old aristocratic reflex, was one way to demonstrate continuity. After all, no one could say the Savoys were letting foreign blood dilute the throne if they kept it strictly in the family. Umberto was born in 1844 to Victor Emmanuel II, the king who would become the first monarch of unified Italy, and Adelaide of Austria, herself a product of Habsburg cousin matching. He was raised to be a soldier first, king second, and man last. Emotionally distant, militaristic, and obsessed with duty, Umberto embodied the new Italian monarchy's attempt to blend northern aristocratic rigor with the romantic spirit of national revolution. Margherita, his first cousin, was born just 3 years later, the daughter of Prince Ferdinand, Duke of Genoa, Umberto's paternal uncle. She was brought up in a similarly narrow world, trained in etiquette, music, languages, and, most importantly, the cultivation of symbolic femininity. When their engagement was announced, no one was surprised. Marriages between cousins were still common among European royalty. The Savoys were simply following the blueprint. Family first, politics second, affection a distant third. But this was no fairy tale. The marriage, like the monarchy itself, was built more on symbolism than sentiment. Their wedding in 1868 was grand, nationalist, and staged as a gesture of unity for a country that was anything but unified. Italy, newly stitched together from old kingdoms, duchies, and republics, was still reeling from decades of civil unrest, regional division, and papal resistance. Rome wouldn't even be part of the kingdom for another 2 years. So the union of Umberto and Margherita was presented not just as a personal bond, but as a metaphor for national cohesion. North and south, king and queen, cousin and cousin. Margherita leaned into the role with skill. She became Italy's first queen consort and quickly established herself as a public icon, cultivating an image of regal patriotism that played well in a country looking for common symbols. She patronized the arts, sponsored charities, and most famously, lent her name to a new dish invented in Naples to celebrate her visit, Pizza Margherita, with its tricolour toppings of tomato, mozzarella, and basil. She became a living embodiment of Italian unity, nationalism, and aristocratic glamour. Umberto, meanwhile, was less beloved. His reign, beginning in 1878, was marked by rigid conservatism, violent crackdowns on dissent, and increasing alignment with reactionary forces. He saw the monarchy as a divine institution, unyielding and absolute. He had little interest in democracy and even less in his wife. Their relationship was cordial but cold. They shared one child, Victor Emmanuel III, the future king, but beyond that lived largely separate lives. Umberto reportedly took lovers. Margherita turned to religion, charity, and ceremonial duties. They functioned more as co-managers of a symbolic institution than as partners in any emotional sense. Still, the cousin bond remained. It was what had made the marriage possible, acceptable, even ideal. In a monarchy that needed to appear ancient and unbroken, a first cousin union was reassuring, a quiet nod to the continuity of royal bloodlines, even as the world around them was modernizing by the minute. But if Margherita played the role of national mother, Umberto became a symbol of national fracture. His iron-fisted approach to dissent, particularly during moments of social unrest, like the Bava Beccaris massacre in Milan, 1898, where troops fired on protesting civilians, made him increasingly unpopular among the working class and political left. The monarchy was becoming a target, not just for criticism, but for violence. In 1900, while visiting Monza, Umberto was assassinated by an anarchist named Gaetano Bresci, who claimed revenge for the massacre in Milan. It was a shocking final act in a slow-burning opera of disconnect. The king, who had been married to his cousin to symbolize national unity, had become a martyr to a country still struggling to agree on what being Italian even meant. Margherita, widowed and draped in black, leaned into her ceremonial role even more deeply, becoming the Dowager Queen, patron of the arts, and unshakable relic of a past already slipping away. She lived until 1926, long enough to see the monarchy waver, the World War redraw the map, and her only son become a king overshadowed by fascism. And if the marriage of cousins was starting to seem outdated by then, don't worry. The next royal couple didn't flinch, because when it came to cousin unions in medieval England, love, loyalty, and inheritance often ran on the same blood. And no king proved this more literally or more fatally than Richard III. 22. Richard III and Anne Neville. By the time Richard III married Anne Neville in 1472, England had already been at war with itself for nearly 2 decades. The country wasn't a kingdom so much as a chessboard, scattered with claimants, corpses, and cousins. Royal blood flowed in every direction, through marriage, inheritance, and battlefield attrition, until the distinction between kinship and competition nearly vanished. In this game, everyone was someone's cousin, and every marriage was both a union and a maneuver. And Richard, the youngest son of the Duke of York, the last king from the House of York and the man who would become the most vilified figure in English history, married a woman who was not only his first cousin once removed, but also the widow of his dead cousin. Because of course he did. This was the Wars of the Roses. The blood was the point. Anne Neville wasn't just any bride. She was the daughter of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known across England and by later historians as the Kingmaker, a title he earned by single-handedly flipping the monarchy twice. First, he helped Edward IV, Richard III's older brother, seize the throne from the Lancastrian Henry VI. Then, after a dramatic falling out, he turned around and reinstalled Henry VI, betraying the very house he helped create. All of this before dying in battle in 1471. Anne's early life had been a whirlwind of forced loyalties and arranged futures. Her first marriage, at just 14, was to Edward of Westminster, the son of Henry VI, a Lancastrian prince, the very enemy of the Yorks. That union was orchestrated by her father, Warwick, to solidify his switch to the Lancastrian cause. But it didn't last long. Edward of Westminster was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, making Anne a teenage widow in a realm divided by violence and intrigue. Enter Richard of Gloucester, Edward IV's younger brother, the future Richard III, a man known at the time not for villainy, but for loyalty, military skill, and political competence. And he had his eye on Anne, not just as a romantic partner, but as a strategic alliance. Because, with Warwick dead and her first husband gone, Anne was now one of the co-heiresses to a vast estate, the Neville fortune. Marrying her would give Richard access not only to land and wealth, but to the lingering legitimacy of the Kingmaker's name. There was just one problem. George, Duke of Clarence, Richard's older brother, had already married Anne's sister, Isabel Neville, and he didn't want to share the inheritance. In one of the more surreal episodes of dynastic squabbling, Anne was allegedly hidden away in London by Clarence, who feared Richard would find and marry her. According to some later accounts, Richard tracked her down working as a kitchen maid in disguise, a story that's probably apocryphal but perfectly on brand for the melodrama of the time. Eventually, Richard prevailed. The marriage was formalized in 1472. The couple, cousins by blood and rivals by inheritance, were now legally and politically aligned. It was a cousin match not born of sentimentality, but of survival. In this world, blood was capital, and marriage was the currency that moved it. For a time, Richard and Anne seemed well matched. They were crowned together in 1483, when Richard seized the throne after the suspicious disappearance of his nephews, the princes in the Tower. Anne, now Queen of England, was described by chroniclers as quiet, dignified and devout, but their reign was brief and the shadows never quite cleared. Their only son, Edward of Middleham, died in 1484 at age 10, possibly of an illness. His death shattered both parents. Without an heir, Richard's claim to the throne, already controversial, became more precarious. Rumours began to swirl. Some whispered that Richard intended to marry his niece Elizabeth of York to secure a new line of succession. Others claimed that Anne, already ill, had been poisoned by Richard to make way for a more strategic match. These were almost certainly slander, later Tudor propaganda aimed at blackening Richard's name. But they stuck, because by then people were ready to believe anything. Anne Neville died in March 1485, likely of tuberculosis or cancer. Her funeral was quiet, almost muted. No grand procession, no elaborate tomb. She was buried at Westminster Abbey in an unmarked grave. Richard reportedly wept, though once again, later chroniclers cast doubt on his sincerity. By then, he had already alienated much of the nobility. The end was coming. Just 5 months later, Richard would die at the Battle of Bosworth Field, the last English king to die in battle. His corpse was stripped, mutilated, and thrown into an anonymous grave, later rediscovered under a Leicester parking lot, a metaphor if ever there was one. Their marriage, two cousins bound by inheritance, survival, and dynastic ambition, was not remarkable for its blood relation. That part was standard. What set it apart was how little it mattered in the end. The inheritance they fought over vanished. The child they produced died. The dynasty collapsed. The Tudor spin machine rewrote the narrative. Richard became the villain, Anne a footnote, and their bloodline a cautionary tale. But the cousin marriage? That was just another day in Plantagenet England. And if this marriage between first cousins, once removed, feels like a prelude to political catastrophe, the next royal pair doubled down with a marriage not only of cousins, but of kings and queens across continents. Because nothing says global strategy like ruling from both ends of Europe, with your family tree doing most of the heavy lifting. 23. Edward I of England and Eleanor of Castile. By the time Edward I of England married Eleanor of Castile in 1254, the idea of marrying your cousin had long ceased to be a scandal. Among medieval royalty, it was practically a reflex, the go-to solution for preserving alliances, consolidating power, and avoiding the political chaos of unfamiliar in-laws. But even in a world where cousin marriage was a political norm, Edward and Eleanor's union stands out. Not just because they were first cousins once removed, but because their marriage, unusually for the era, actually functioned. It didn't just hold the crown together, it held them together too. Edward, the future Longshanks and the eventual conqueror of Wales and Hammer of the Scots, was born in 1239 to Henry III of England and Eleanor of Provence. He was a Plantagenet through and through, tall, intense, militant, and deeply conscious of royal authority. His bride, Eleanor of Castile, was the daughter of Ferdinand III of Castile and Joan of Ponthieu, and that's where the bloodline begins to curl. Eleanor's mother, Joan, was the granddaughter of King Henry II of England, making Eleanor a descendant of the Angevin line. Edward, too, was a great-grandson of Henry II through a different child. That made them first cousins once removed, connected by a relatively narrow genetic corridor. In the modern world, this would raise eyebrows. In the 13th century, it raised dowries. Their marriage was arranged when Edward was just 15 and Eleanor around 13, a typical age for strategic pairings. The match was brokered as part of the Treaty of Gascony, intended to solidify English influence in southern France and build ties with the increasingly powerful Kingdom of Castile. There was nothing romantic about it, at least at the start. It was logistics, signed, sealed, and celebrated with the usual amount of pageantry and property. But something rare happened after the signatures dried and the ink faded. They actually grew to love each other. Now, love in royal marriages was never expected. It was at best a pleasant surprise and at worst a liability. But Edward and Eleanor seemed to defy the pattern. She accompanied him everywhere, on military campaigns, diplomatic missions, even to the Holy Land during the Ninth Crusade. In an age where queens were often relegated to castles and birthing chambers, Eleanor travelled with Edward across Europe and beyond, crossing deserts, navigating disease, and surviving battlefields. During their crusade in the Levant, Edward was famously injured, some say by a poisoned dagger. Eleanor was said to have nursed him personally, refusing to leave his side. The apocryphal version of the tale includes her sucking poison from his wound, a detail that, while almost certainly invented by later romantics, speaks to the enduring myth of their closeness. It was a public marriage, yes, but also a private bond. Eleanor bore Edward at least 16 children, though only 6 survived infancy. A grim but unsurprising statistic in the medieval world. Their daughter, Joan of Acre, would go on to make her own scandalous marital choices. Their son, Edward II, would inherit the throne and become infamous for entirely different reasons. But during their long marriage, Eleanor was not merely a mother of heirs. She was an active participant in governance, land management, and even literary patronage. She held estates in her own name, managed finances, and influenced court culture with Castilian traditions and tastes. Her death in 1290 devastated Edward. She died in Nottinghamshire while accompanying him on a northern journey. What followed was one of the most famous acts of royal mourning in English history, the Eleanor Crosses. Edward ordered a memorial erected at each place her funeral procession stopped on its journey back to London, 12 in total, including the famous Charing Cross. These were not simply grave markers, they were monuments of devotion, granite testaments to a royal marriage that unusually meant something more than policy. And yet, for all their affection, the marriage was still a dynastic alliance between cousins. That part never went away. The Plantagenets, like all ruling houses of the age, treated family trees as something to be folded, not branched. Marrying a cousin wasn't a mistake, it was a method. You knew where they came from. You knew their claims, their loyalties, their blood, and if that meant the gene pool ran shallow, well, so be it. Better a shallow pool than one filled with foreign ambition. Edward would go on to remarry after Eleanor's death, taking Margaret of France as his second wife. But no one remembers that love story. It was Eleanor, his cousin, his queen, whose memory he carved into stone. Still, if Edward and Eleanor's marriage seems like a rare example of a successful cousin union, don't get too sentimental. Because the next king wasn't the result of a happy alliance. He was the product of an uncle-niece marriage that turned genetics into pathology, a boy born to rule but raised in pain, whose body became the symbol of an empire collapsing under the weight of its own blood. 24. Charles II of Spain. If the Habsburg dynasty had a closing argument, a final tragic case study in the perils of royal endogamy, it would be named Charles II of Spain. By the time of his birth in 1661, nearly 2 centuries of repeated cousin and uncle-niece marriages had distilled the Spanish Habsburg gene pool into something less like a lineage and more like a blueprint for biological collapse. And Charles, the last of his line, inherited not only the crown of one of the largest empires in the world, but also the full painful sum of that genetic gamble. Charles was the son of Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, who were naturally uncle and niece. That made Charles the great-nephew and grandson of the same man. In his family tree, branches didn't just cross, they looped. To fully grasp what Charles inherited, it helps to look at his extended pedigree. The Habsburgs had, for generations, practiced a marriage strategy that prioritized blood purity over genetic health. Marriages were made between cousins, uncles and nieces, sometimes even double cousins, where both sides of the family were already related. The goal was dynastic consolidation, keeping lands, titles and crowns within the family. The unintended consequence was the Habsburg jaw, a prominent prognathism that increasingly defined the family's portraits and a host of deeper, less visible hereditary disorders. Charles was born visibly affected. Contemporary sources describe him as weak, often ill, and late to speak or walk. His tongue was too large for his mouth, and his jaw, the infamous Habsburg chin, protruded so far that he had difficulty chewing. His early years were marked by frequent illness, and many assumed he would not survive childhood. But survive he did, though survival was not the same as health, and health was not the same as competence. Still, the Spanish court clung to the fiction of divine rule. Charles, despite his frailty, was king, and that meant he had 2 duties: rule an empire and produce an heir. He failed at both, and not entirely through fault of his own. His reign, which began in 1665 when he was just 4 years old, was dominated early on by regents and court factions, particularly his mother Mariana, whose influence became a court in itself. Spain, once the most formidable power in Europe, was now a declining empire stretched thin by war, debt, and internal corruption. Charles, as king, was more of a figurehead, a symbol of a dynasty propped up by inertia and diplomacy rather than strength. He married twice. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, reportedly tried to support him emotionally but died without bearing children. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was chosen for her famously fertile family. Her sisters had produced dozens of heirs between them, but even this pairing resulted in no offspring. Rumors swirled about impotence, curses, witchcraft, and divine punishment. In reality, the cause was probably much simpler. Charles's genetic inheritance had rendered him sterile. By the 1690s, it was clear that Charles II would not produce an heir. The European powers began circling, eyeing the vast Spanish Empire, which included territories in the Americas, the Netherlands, Italy, and beyond, as ripe for division. The question was not if the dynasty would fall, but who would catch its crown when it did. Charles, for all his limitations, was not unaware. He knew his reign was a sunset. He became increasingly devout, even paranoid. He ordered multiple exorcisms and religious processions to rid himself of supposed demons. His court fell into infighting. Ministers plotted. Foreign ambassadors made side deals. The once mighty Spanish court had become a tragic theatre, with Charles its sad, soft-spoken centerpiece. In his will, Charles named Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his successor, hoping to keep the empire intact by passing it to another Catholic branch of royalty. Instead, he sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would redraw the map of Europe and mark the true end of Habsburg Spain. Charles died in 1700 at the age of 38. An autopsy, which should be taken with caution given the era and the politics, claimed his body was filled with signs of decay, a heart the size of a peppercorn, a single testicle, and no blood. Whether symbolic or scientific, the message was clear. Charles was physically and dynastically spent. His death ended the Spanish Habsburg line, not with a bang, but with a tragic, awkward silence. He was mourned not for what he had accomplished. There was little of that, but for what he had symbolized, the final generation of a dynasty that had clung too tightly to itself until there was nothing left to hold. And yet, in another corner of Europe, cousin marriage continued, not as a failing strategy, but as a fully functioning tradition. Because, while Charles's bloodline may have collapsed, the broader custom of marrying one's close kin was still very much alive, including among royals who appeared healthy, charismatic, and thoroughly in charge of their sprawling, sunlit empires. Take, for example, a royal couple in Naples who, despite the lessons of Charles II, kept it comfortably in the family. Because nothing says dynastic confidence like marrying your first cousin after centuries of proof that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't the best idea. 25. Francis II of the Two Sicilies and Maria Sophie of Bavaria. In the sun-drenched south of Italy, far from the Gothic shadows of Vienna or the sombre intrigue of Madrid, the kingdom of the Two Sicilies clung to its monarchical identity well into the 19th century, a pocket of dynastic conservatism wrapped in Catholic ritual and familial familiarity. At its helm, in the final days of its existence, was Francis II of the Two Sicilies, the last reigning king of that house, who, staying true to the playbook of Europe's ruling elites, married his first cousin, Maria Sophie of Bavaria, in a union that was less about romance and more about ritual, obedience, and the final performances of a dying world. Francis was born in 1836, the only son of Ferdinand II, a strong-willed Bourbon monarch with absolutist instincts, and his first wife, Maria Christina of Savoy, herself a product of dynastic pairing. As heir to the kingdom of the Two Sicilies, Francis was destined to rule over a patchwork domain that included Naples, Sicily, and the surrounding southern Italian territories. His world was deeply conservative, highly ceremonial, and profoundly distrustful of modernity, especially the kind creeping in from France and the north. Maria Sophie, born in 1841, was a Duchess of Bavaria and also, conveniently, his first cousin through shared grandparents in the tangled Bourbon family tree. She was the sister of Empress Elizabeth Sisi of Austria, which already gave her a veneer of courtly mystique. But unlike her dreamy, melancholic sister, Maria Sophie was known for her intelligence, sharp tongue, and quiet defiance. She was beautiful, well-educated, and fiercely loyal, the kind of woman one might admire even without a dynastic agenda. But admiration wasn't the reason they married. Bloodline was. The marriage was arranged with almost mechanical precision. Cousins marrying cousins had become so normalized among royal families that any objections, moral, medical, or personal, were considered at best quaint. More importantly, Francis's father, Ferdinand II, believed that Maria Sophie, being both royal and German, would bring added legitimacy and cultural prestige to the Bourbon court in Naples. They were wed by proxy in 1858 when Maria Sophie was just 16. When she arrived in Naples shortly thereafter, the real ceremony followed. The marriage was now public, sealed and binding, a dynastic handshake disguised as a wedding. Francis, then 22, was shy, awkward, and already weighed down by the expectations of a crumbling kingdom. His court was rigid, stifling, and full of men twice his age whispering about revolution, loyalty, and the always looming threat of Garibaldi. Maria Sophie, by contrast, was animated, sociable, and subtly rebellious. She didn't fit easily into the narrow confines of Neapolitan royalty, nor did she try to. Their early marriage was strained. Francis, raised in a deeply religious environment, was reserved to a fault. Some chroniclers, and certainly many later gossips, claimed the marriage was unconsummated for a long time due to Francis's anxieties and inexperience. These were the kinds of rumors that courts loved, quiet, plausible, and rooted in the delicious possibility that a king might fail in the one duty no king was allowed to botch: producing an heir. Eventually a daughter was born, but she died in infancy. The couple had no surviving children. Their marriage, already symbolic in its formation, remained symbolic in its outcome. No legacy, no continuation, just a royal portrait framed by history. But Maria Sophie's role in Francis's life and in the final years of the kingdom would transcend the duties of wife or queen. She became something else entirely: a wartime partner, a political symbol, and briefly, a rallying figure for a vanishing monarchy. In 1860, as Garibaldi's forces advanced from the north, Francis and Maria Sophie were forced to flee Naples. The capital fell with barely a struggle, but the royal couple took refuge in the fortress of Gaeta, a seaside citadel where they staged a final doomed resistance against the forces of Italian unification. It was here, under bombardment, that Maria Sophie earned a reputation as the heroine of Gaeta. She walked the battlements, visited the wounded, encouraged the troops. Soldiers revered her, newspapers romanticized her. For a moment, she stopped being a cousin wife and became something rarer, a queen fighting not just for her throne, but for her husband's dignity. But even legends have expiration dates. After a prolonged siege, Francis and Maria Sophie surrendered. They were exiled to Rome and later to Austria. The kingdom of the two Sicilies was absorbed into the new kingdom of Italy. The Bourbon dream, long propped up by cousin marriages and divine right rhetoric, dissolved almost overnight. Francis, broken and mild, lived the rest of his life in relative obscurity, dying in 1894. Maria Sophie, however, lingered in the imagination. She outlived the monarchy, the century, and nearly every man who had once advised her husband. She became a figure of nostalgia, the last queen of a lost kingdom, born of cousin blood, crowned by resistance. Their marriage, like their monarchy, was a study in anachronism. Even as the world around them modernized, the Bourbons kept marrying within the family, as if tradition alone could stop time. But cousinhood, as it turns out, is no shield against revolution. And speaking of dynasties clinging to cousin marriage like a holy relic, look no further than the sprawling House of Braganza and its New World experiment. Because when Portugal decided to export monarchy across the Atlantic, the man they sent to rule Brazil brought his close family with him, straight down the aisle. 26. Pedro I of Brazil, Pedro IV of Portugal, and Leopoldina of Austria. When Pedro I of Brazil, also known as Pedro IV of Portugal, declared Brazil's independence from Portugal in 1822 and became its first emperor, he did so with a sword raised under the open skies of Sao Paulo and a proclamation that would echo for centuries: Independencia ou morte, independence or death. It was dramatic, theatrical, and self-consciously epic, just like Pedro himself. And like many monarchs before him, Pedro didn't rule alone. He married. And not just anyone. He married Leopoldina of Austria, an archduchess from the Habsburg dynasty, a woman whose bloodline was already folded in on itself through generations of strategic inbreeding. Their marriage was, in the clearest possible sense, dynastically engineered, a cousin-level match formed through overlapping royal houses, especially between the Habsburgs and Braganzas, and its impact would stretch from the palaces of Lisbon to the jungles of Brazil. Let's start with the players. Pedro was the son of King João VI of Portugal and Carlota Joaquina of Spain, who were themselves closely related. Carlota Joaquina was João's niece, yes, niece, and their marriage was a tense theatrical tragedy in itself. Their children, therefore, including Pedro, were born with a family tree that barely branched. By the time Pedro was old enough to marry, he was already an heir to two interconnected crowns and the living embodiment of several generations of Habsburg-Bourbon-Braganza DNA overlap. Leopoldina, meanwhile, was the daughter of Francis II, the last Holy Roman Emperor, and Maria Theresa of Naples and Sicily. Herself the daughter of King Ferdinand I of the two Sicilies and Maria Carolina of Austria. If that sounds like a long loop of interlocking cousin marriages, it's because it was. She was, by birth, a cousin-level match to Pedro several times over. On paper, this was perfect. Politically safe, genetically familiar, diplomatic gold. They were married by proxy in 1817. And Leopoldina travelled by ship to Rio de Janeiro to join her new husband in a country still technically ruled from afar by her father-in-law. But Pedro was no ordinary royal, and Brazil was no ordinary kingdom. By 1822, Pedro would break from Portugal and declare himself Emperor of Brazil, with Leopoldina at his side as Empress Consort. Unlike many royal brides sent across oceans for alliance, Leopoldina adapted quickly. She studied Portuguese and Brazilian history, learned about the geography and politics of her new home, and became a trusted advisor to Pedro. In many ways, she was more prepared to govern than he was. Where Pedro was impulsive, hot-tempered, and famously unfaithful, Leopoldina was grounded, methodical, and deeply intelligent. But marriage, especially royal marriage, is rarely a simple equation of mutual respect. Despite Leopoldina's loyalty and political skill, Pedro carried on with a long line of affairs, most notoriously with Domitila de Castro, whom he made the Marchioness of Santos and publicly installed in court. The scandal was as humiliating as it was predictable. The young empress, descended from centuries of royal house pride, was expected to endure it silently, and for years she did. Behind the palace walls, however, Leopoldina's health and spirit declined. The burden of public humiliation, numerous pregnancies, she bore 7 children, many of whom died in infancy, and the constant political tightrope she walked as both a foreign-born queen and a member of a tangled European dynasty began to take their toll. Despite everything, she remained committed to Brazil, more than Pedro, some argued, and was crucial in the early foundation of Brazilian imperial legitimacy. Her most critical moment came during Pedro's absence in 1822. While he was away, Leopoldina presided over the Council of State and signed the decree that effectively pushed Brazil toward independence. She was, in a very real sense, one of the first architects of an independent Brazil, a fact often overshadowed by the iconography of Pedro's sword and horse. She died in 1826 at just 29 years old, from complications exacerbated by childbirth and emotional strain. Her death shocked the empire and triggered a rare moment of genuine remorse in Pedro. His political career would continue and grow increasingly erratic until he abdicated the Brazilian throne in favor of his young son, Pedro II, and returned to Europe to fight for Portuguese liberalism. Pedro himself died in 1834, leaving behind two nations shaped by his ambition and a legacy punctuated by the contradictions of his marriage to Leopoldina, a union both symbolic and strategic, affectionate yet unbalanced, rooted in shared blood but fractured by incompatible roles. Their cousin marriage was far from unusual in royal circles. What made it unique was the backdrop. Not a palace in Vienna or a chateau in Madrid, but a newly independent empire carved out of the tropics. A place where European dynasties tried to graft their old-world politics onto new soil, with results both visionary and doomed. And yet, even in the age of rising republics and decaying monarchies, the cousin match still endured, especially in kingdoms that saw themselves as guardians of tradition. One such place was the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, where a modern monarch and his young bride would revive the custom with a 20th century gloss. Still cousins, still royal, but framed now in cameras, protocol, and a very different kind of political necessity. 27. Hussein of Jordan and Dina bint Abdul Hamid. In the 20th century, when most monarchies were fading into ceremonial pageantry or vanishing entirely under the weight of revolutions, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan was still in the business of power, real power, and so it made perfect sense that King Hussein, the boy monarch who would spend nearly 5 decades on the throne, would begin his reign with a marriage that reflected the oldest logic in the royal playbook: marry within the family. Strengthen the bloodline, keep your allies close and your cousins closer. His bride, Dina bint Abdul Hamid, an educated, independent and elegant Hashemite, and also his second cousin. By now, the world had largely moved on from cousin marriage as a celebrated institution. It was still legal in many places, still quietly practiced in certain aristocratic or religious circles, but rarely did it come with the ceremonial fanfare of kings and queens. Yet, in the Hashemite court, a dynasty descended directly, they claimed, from the Prophet Muhammad, endogamy was less about nostalgia and more about legacy. The Hashemites traced their lineage back 1,400 years, and when you're working with that kind of history, family isn't just family, it's destiny. Hussein was born in 1935, a grandson of King Abdullah I, the founder of the modern Jordanian state. When Abdullah was assassinated in 1951, Hussein, just 15 at the time, became the heir, and by 1953 the teenage prince was king. His ascension came at a volatile time. The region was burning with decolonization, pan-Arabism, Zionism, and Cold War interference. His rule would be shaped by wars, palace coups, shifting alliances, and survival by strategy. And part of that strategy was marriage. In 1955, at the age of 19, King Hussein married Dina bint Abdul Hamid, his second cousin on his father's side, a descendant like him of the Hashemite line through Sharif Hussein of Mecca. The marriage was orchestrated with all the right signals: royal blood, religious legitimacy, and a shared family tree that, if plotted visually, probably looked more like a spiral than a branch. But Dina was not a passive royal ornament. She was 26, 7 years older than Hussein, and had been educated at Cambridge University, a rare feat for an Arab princess at the time. She held a degree in English literature and had taught at Cairo University. Fluent in European thought and politics, she was deeply modern, fiercely intelligent, and from the outset, resistant to being merely ornamental. The marriage was short. By 1957, barely 2 years in, Dinah left the palace. Officially, the divorce was explained with vague diplomatic language about differences of opinion. In practice, it was a clash between tradition and modernity, royalty and autonomy. A teenage king under pressure, and a queen who refused to be quietly managed. Dinah reportedly wanted a more egalitarian relationship. Hussein wanted a queen who fit the mold. The Hashemite court, already juggling regional instability, didn't have much patience for internal rebellion. Still, the marriage and its failure marked a turning point. It showed the strain between inherited power and personal freedom, even among royals with centuries of divine right behind them. Dinah later became an outspoken advocate for Arab nationalism and Palestinian rights, eventually marrying a high-ranking member of the PLO. Her life, post-Hashemite court, was anything but quiet. For Hussein, the dissolution of the marriage didn't damage his reputation. If anything, it reinforced his image as a pragmatic ruler, one willing to adjust, adapt, and move forward. He would go on to marry 3 more times, none to cousins, each with its own political and symbolic significance. But that first marriage, brief, symbolic, cousin-bonded, still lingers in the royal ledger. Because it wasn't just about love or compatibility. It was about continuity, about preserving a legacy that stretched not just across generations, but centuries. In marrying a cousin, Hussein wasn't making a personal decision. He was signaling allegiance to a dynastic worldview in which family meant more than romance. It meant rulership, legitimacy, divine mandate, and if the match didn't last, the logic behind it endured. Even today, the Hashemite dynasty invokes its bloodline as part of its right to govern, a right traced through ancestors, not ideologies. And in a region where borders and regimes are constantly contested, lineage still matters. Sometimes more than law, more than policy, more than popular will. And Jordan wasn't the only modern kingdom keeping it in the family. Far from it. Just to the southeast, in a land where tradition is not just respected but codified into governance, one royal house would take cousin marriage from private custom to public institution, building not just a family, but a nation out of it. Because in Saudi Arabia, the House of Saud wasn't just marrying cousins, they were marrying cousins on repeat, like it was a constitutional clause written in DNA. 28. Abdulaziz ibn Saud, Saudi Arabia and first cousin marriages. In the 20th century, as oil refineries flared into the desert sky and Western powers shifted nervously on the chessboard of the Middle East, Abdulaziz ibn Saud, founder of modern Saudi Arabia, was building something far older, a kingdom rooted not just in conquest, but in blood, literal dynastic tribal blood. And like so many monarchs before him, he turned to a time-tested method of consolidating power and eliminating uncertainty. First cousin marriages, not once, not twice, but over and over again, until the family tree became less a tree and more a well-maintained hedge. Born in 1875 into the ruling house of Al Saud, Abdulaziz, known in the West as Ibn Saud, would go on to unify the Arabian Peninsula through a blend of diplomacy, military campaign, religious alliance, and familial fusion. He didn't just conquer tribes, he married into them. And if they were already related, even better. Among his many wives, some say he had over 20, a significant number were his first cousins. These unions weren't accidents. They were strategic alliances designed to reinforce ties within the sprawling Al Saud family and cement his authority over the interrelated tribal networks of the Najd and beyond. In this world, cousin marriage wasn't just acceptable, it was politically optimal. In Bedouin and tribal Arab culture, cousin marriage, especially between fathers, brothers, children, or patrilineal cousins, has long been viewed not as taboo, but as preferable. The idea was simple: trust what you know. Marry within your own bloodline to keep property, loyalty, and power enclosed. For Ibn Saud, already a man uniting a land through force and faith, cousin marriage wasn't archaic. It was statecraft, and it worked. Through these marriages, Abdulaziz not only unified warring factions, but produced a dynasty of heirs. He is said to have fathered at least 45 sons, some claim over 50, and many daughters, whose interconnections still define the modern Saudi monarchy today. Many of his sons, including King Saud, King Faisal, King Khalid, and King Fahd, became rulers themselves. Their mothers, often cousins of the king. These marriages weren't just about reproducing heirs, they were about engineering loyalty within the ruling elite. By marrying cousins, Ibn Saud avoided bringing in new, unpredictable lineages. He ensured that competing bloodlines didn't rise within the palace walls. Everyone, quite literally, had skin in the game, and the legacy of these practices runs deep. Even in the present day, cousin marriage remains widespread in Saudi Arabia, not just among royals, but across many segments of society. Studies have shown that the rate of consanguineous marriage in Saudi Arabia hovers around 50%, with first cousin marriage making up a substantial portion. Among the royals, it's even higher, because dynasties do not take genetic risks. Of course, there are consequences. The repeated concentration of genes, especially over generations, can increase the risk of certain hereditary disorders. The House of Saud, like other royal families before them, has faced quiet concerns about health outcomes. But the tradition persists, not because of ignorance, but because of political calculus. It's a trade-off: power over diversity, familiarity over variability, control over chance. Abdulaziz ibn Saud didn't invent cousin marriage, he merely perfected it for the 20th century monarchy. His rule wasn't about charisma or myth, it was about systems. Bloodlines were infrastructure, cousinhood was policy. And when you think about it, it's not so different from what ancient dynasties did. The pharaohs, the Ptolemies, the Habsburgs all bound themselves into tighter and tighter genetic circles, hoping that political stability could outweigh biological cost. In many cases, it didn't, but in the case of Saudi Arabia, the system endures. Still, this model of royal endogamy wasn't limited to deserts or distant antiquity. Even in the lush islands of the Pacific, far from the cathedrals and courts of Europe or the oil palaces of Riyadh, cousin marriage was practiced, not out of political paranoia, but as an expression of sacred lineage, a way to keep power divine and unbroken. And no royal house did this with more pride or more continuity than Tonga. 29. Taufar Hau Tupu IV, Tonga and Royal Endogamy. The Kingdom of Tonga, a small Pacific archipelago with fewer than 200,000 people, is often seen as a serene outpost of Polynesian tradition, where time moves slower, customs run deeper, and history is worn like a woven mat. But beneath the palm fronds and ceremonial dances lies a royal system every bit as complex, calculated, and genetically insular as its European and Middle Eastern counterparts. And at its apex in the 20th century stood King Taufar Hau Tupu IV, who married into his own extended family in accordance with long-standing royal endogamy. Born in 1918, Taufar Hau Tupu IV reigned from 1965 to 2006, one of the longest-serving monarchs of the modern era. And while much of his rule was defined by the slow modernization of the Tongan state, his marriage to Queen Halevalu Mataho Ahomey was a deliberate continuation of Tongan royal cousin marriage tradition. A cultural practice rooted not in European-style dynasty games, but in the sacred structure of Polynesian chiefly lines. In Tonga, the royal family is not simply elevated by political function, it is sanctified by lineage. The monarch is believed to be descended directly from divine ancestors, and this genealogy must be protected at all costs, not just socially, but biologically. That means marrying within the chiefly class, and often within one's own kin, to maintain the manner or spiritual authority of the bloodline. Queen Halevalu, like the king, came from noble stock. She was of high chiefly lineage, related to the king through multiple ancestral connections, not necessarily first cousin, but certainly close kin within the acceptable boundaries of Tongan endogamy. Their union was not just socially endorsed, it was sacredly necessary. It ensured that their children, including King George Tupu V and King Tupu VI, would be born with unbroken access to dynastic mana. And it's no accident that Tonga remains the only monarchy in the Pacific. Other island nations abandoned kingship, often under colonial pressure or post-independence idealism. But Tonga held firm, because its monarchy isn't just a Western import. It's a cultural cornerstone, and its blood-based legitimacy is the key to its survival. Taufa'ahau's rule modernized Tonga in many ways, increasing infrastructure, introducing new forms of governance, and navigating global politics. But his marriage and family structure stayed loyal to the old ways. Unlike European monarchies, where cousin marriage eventually became an embarrassment or a political liability, in Tonga it remained a living right, and the consequences surprisingly few, at least on the surface. The royal children appeared healthy, the monarchy retained legitimacy, and cousin marriage, far from being questioned, was still honored as a link to divine authority. But even this island fortress of tradition wasn't immune to the slow erosion of global norms. The younger generation of Tongan royals began quietly to marry outside the inner circle, causing ripples of controversy within the island's tightly guarded nobility. Still, the precedent set by King Taufa'ahau IV, marrying within the chiefly family to preserve power, remains a pillar of royal Tongan identity. His reign ended in 2006, but the bloodlines he protected still sit on the throne. And in a world where monarchies increasingly rely on optics, public relations, and democratic posturing, Tonga's royal house remains refreshingly, or unsettlingly, rooted in blood. But even this proud island tradition pales in comparison to what came before it, an older kingdom, another Pacific paradise, where sibling marriage wasn't just accepted, it was mandated by the gods. Because before Tonga crowned its cousin kings, the Hawaiian Islands enthroned a ruler who married his full sister in a tradition that saw blood not as a danger, but as divine perfection. 30. Kamehameha II and Queen Kamamalu, Hawaii. In the pre-colonial Hawaiian world, power didn't flow from parliaments or papal bulls. It descended directly from the heavens, from gods whose bloodlines lived on through the bodies of kings and queens. And among the ancient alii, the sacred chiefs of Hawaii, the purest bloodline wasn't a political advantage. It was a divine requirement. Which is why, when Kamehameha II married his full sister, Kamamalu, no one gasped, no one wrote letters, no one whispered scandal, because in the islands this was not incest. This was sacred consolidation. Kamehameha II, born Liholiho, was the son of Kamehameha I, the legendary unifier of the Hawaiian Islands. When his father died in 1819, Liholiho inherited not only the throne, but the theological mantle of mana, spiritual authority, that had long governed the alii caste. That mana, according to Hawaiian tradition, could be enhanced, purified, and protected through paeao marriage, the union of full siblings. Kamamalu, his wife and sister, was not a passive consort. She was the physical counterpart to Liholiho's kingship. Together, they embodied the purest known line of chiefly blood on the islands, their union seen as a metaphysical alignment, a joining of divine essence. This wasn't a whispered secret or a regrettable necessity. It was a royal ideal. European visitors, however, were less understanding. When Christian missionaries arrived in Hawaii in the early 19th century, many from New England, armed with Bibles, manners, and quiet horror, they encountered a culture that revered sibling unions as spiritually perfect. And while some Hawaiians began to convert and question old customs, the alii class clung to their traditions, at least for a while. Kamehameha II's marriage to Kamamalu remained public, unapologetic, and explicitly rooted in ancient law. But the political climate was changing. Within just a few years of Liholiho's reign, the centuries-old kapu system, the complex code of religious laws that governed Hawaiian society, was dismantled under pressure from both internal reformers and external influences. Liholiho himself helped abolish it, setting fire to sacred idols and allowing men and women to eat together again, a direct challenge to the ancient order. And yet, his marriage to Kamamalu endured. Even as Christian ideals began reshaping the kingdom's courts and schools, the royal marriage remained a tether to a vanishing world. They were a bridge between two cosmologies, one grounded in ancestor gods and divine rank, the other in Western morality and imported propriety. In 1824, Kamehameha II and Kamamalu sailed to England, becoming the first Hawaiian monarchs to travel to Europe. It was a political mission, meant to secure recognition from King George IV and demonstrate that Hawaii was a sovereign, civilized kingdom. The journey was historic, the optics were perfect. A young king and queen, regal and exotic, representing a proud island nation on the world stage. But tragedy followed. Soon after arriving in London, both Kamehameha II and Kamamalu fell ill with measles, a disease against which they, like many Pacific Islanders, had no immunity. Kamamalu died first, followed days later by Liholiho. Their bodies were returned to Hawaii aboard the HMS Blonde, a ship now soaked in symbolic irony, a vessel meant to carry diplomacy that instead brought home death. Their deaths marked more than the loss of two young royals. They signaled the end of an era. With the passing of Liholiho and Kamamalu, the last major royal sibling marriage in Hawaiian history was extinguished. The tide of missionary influence, Western medicine and colonial politics swept in even faster. The practice of paeo unions, once central to Hawaiian kingship, vanished beneath the waves of Christianization and public health discourse. Still, their union remains a defining chapter in Hawaiian royal history, a reminder that in some places royal incest was not a scandal but a sacrament. And while the West may have recoiled, the alii saw it differently, a mirror held up to the gods, reflecting power in its purest form. But Hawaii wasn't alone in building thrones atop sacred incest. In fact, long before Liholiho and Kamamalu, another island kingdom, across the Pacific and into the heart of the Mediterranean, made sibling marriage the cornerstone of empire. Which brings us to Caligula's imperial heirs, to uncle-niece weddings, to dynasties that burn through their own blood to keep crowns in place. But let's not jump ahead. We've got one more royal pair who kept it unapologetically in the family, because not all modern cousin marriages came with the weight of ancient gods or divine right. Some just came with enormous oil wealth, ruling families, and a very public royal wedding.